Chapter 1328. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:44 and 11 seconds p.m. Chapter 1328. One task: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1328. One task: the broad chest of the young man was completely exposed, rippling with strength and muscles that could have fit right in with the sheer cliff. His bottom half was covered in tight black legging that sunk into every crevice, peak and valley of his monstrous quads, and the only other accessory on his body was a fur-covered belt that seemed to double as a spatial device. Unfortunately, this fashion choice but this overly large young man placed the outline of a set of family jewels, and their crowning achievement, on far too great a display. But it was either this young man hadn't noticed the provocativeness of his style of dress, or he simply didn't care. This young man was none other than the third individual Conan Leo had mentioned during his tirade, Armand of the Terrius family. He, indeed, didn't care about this appearance, nor was he trying to be provocative. Much like Lionel, he was only concerned with being as comfortable as possible. If it was up to him, he would be completely naked as he walked about and interacted with the world. But his father had berated him one too many times about such a thing. Some nonsense about how they were already seen as brutish enough without him confirming stereotypes, so he could only compromise in this way. Of course, the patriarch of the Terrius family was still infuriated by his son's choices. But at this point, it was already much too late to do anything about his disposition. What was done was done. At least his future daughter-in-law would see what she was working with before she married into their family. Clearly, the father was just as brazen and brutish as the son, or else he would have never had such a thought to begin with. Armand's feet swung back and forth on the edge of platform, stretching and yawning from time to time. He seemed a bit disappointed with the view, but there wasn't much even he could do about the fog. This chapter upload first at NovelBin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. Armand looked up and matched Lionel's gaze almost the instant the latter locked eyes with him. His head titled to the side, his muscles involuntarily rippling of their own accord. He didn't even notice Lionel's violet gold cloak until several moments had passed. Oh, everything about Armand just a moment before, if one disregarded his size, was entirely innocent. He swung his feet, he calmly observed his surroundings, and he looked like a bit of an airhead one might want to protect. However, the moment he laid eyes on Lionel, his demeanor seemed to shift entirely. His gaze didn't become cold, nor did he release some fiendish or violent aura. Rather, his irises gained a glossy sort of look to them as his tilted head slowly straightened. His heartbeat slowed to a crawl. His skin slightly tensed and reddened, and everything around him seemed to grind to a halt as though force itself was too scared to move. Lionel's own gaze narrowed. This look. It reminded him of something. His mind was sent into a dry prairie land with tall grasslands of brown and yellow. In the distance, a lion slowly stalked its prey, its reflective irises peeking through the strands of grass and fusing with the land. There was no rage in its eyes, no anticipation, no killing intent. Its emotions were impossible to read, but even as your own legs quaked, even as your knees weakened and cold sweat poured down your back, it simply continued to slowly stalk forward, its four limbs gently gliding from one to another, its path connected to you by an invisible tether. You probably knew that you should run, but you knew that you would be too slow. You thought that maybe you should fight, but you knew that you would be too weak. You might scramble and hope to distract it or give it a meal that was more enticing, but you could see that it only had eyes for your warm flesh. That glassy look in Armand's eyes was no different. His twin axes, each with blades half the size of his enormous body, released a slight aura, a blackish sort of force that made the temperature plummet. Lionel could feel his blood run cold. It wasn't completely out of his control. The weakness of his snowy star owl lineage factor seemed to manifest in full force now, meeting a creature that stood so far above itself. This chapter upload first at NovelBin.net. In that moment, Lionel's quiet observation warped, his brows furrowing and a deep pit of disgust deepening within his belly. He hadn't been in a rush to meditate upon the bronze tablet to improve his lineage factor before, mostly because he simply hadn't had the time yet. By the time he had recovered enough to train, they had already delayed the Void Palace enough, and had to leave. But this feeling almost made him want to vomit. Right then, a burning sensation raced through Lionel's veins. A strong force threatened to incinerate his blood to ash. Aina frowned, looking toward Lionel. She could tell that something was off, but she wasn't a mind reader. It was difficult to pinpoint exactly what the problem was. Lionel closed his eyes, taking deep breaths. He forcefully suppressed the feeling. He would just end up harming himself if he acted on impulse. But he had already decided, he would definitely purge himself of this lineage factor. That said, he would first use this so-called weak lineage factor to put Armand in his place. He had been thoroughly provoked. Armand had no way of reading Lionel's thoughts. All he felt was a weak creature cowering away. He lost any interest he had had. At this point, he felt the only thing interesting about Lionel was his amethyst token. He would definitely be leaving here with it in his hands. At that moment, the platforms rumbled, beams of light suddenly jetting out and connecting them all. In those final moments, what was presumably the last platform had appeared to trigger all of this. And it was unsurprisingly Simona, who had managed to make it back. You only have one task: survive and make it back to safety. The rumbling voice of a woman cast over them all. And then they all disappeared. This year would indeed be different. Up until now, nothing too out of the norm had occurred. But now the true dark nature of what it meant to be a protector of humanity would show. Chapter 1329. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:44 and 10 seconds p.m. Chapter 1329. Foul odor. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1329. Foul odor alarms went off in Lionel's mind. Without the slightest hesitation, he reached outward and grabbed onto little Blackstar tight. At the same time, he used his other arm to wrap around Aina's waist. A strong king's might erupted from him like a pillar piercing through the skies. He held back nothing as he enveloped all three of them just before his vision went completely black. Lionel's head swam, however he only allowed it to do so for a brief moment before he activated Dream Sense. What? Lionel's heart froze, his blood running cold. He tried to use Dream Sense again, but it failed once more just like it had the first time. The realization made him remember a particular conversation he had had with Wise Star Order, and his brows immediately furrowed. Taking a deep breath, Lionel dug deep. He had managed to make a faint connection with his soul, and it could be considered to be partially awakened. However, he couldn't use his own nearly as freely as Wise Star Order could, and he even somewhat avoided using anything other than its passive strengthening upon being accessed. Now though Lionel felt that waking up his mind was far more important than anything else, Lionel's soul became like an anchor, stabilizing his mind and his senses. Everything slowly snapped back into place. First, his proprioception came back and he could feel his limbs in space once again. He could tell that his grip on Aina and Blackstar were still there even though he couldn't feel them. Then came his sense of smell, but he almost immediately recoiled. The air smelt like hot sulfur and rotten boiled eggs. He almost immediately began to hack and wheeze, or at the very least, he thought he did. It was still hard to sense much of anything. He could just barely make out the shaking of his head. This chapter upload first at NovelBin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. Finally, his sense of touch came back, and he could confirm that he did indeed still have Blackstar and Aina by his side. Both were absolutely still and unmoving. Once these senses settled in, Lionel's eyesight finally came back. But what he saw made him narrow his eyes once again. Unfortunately, this was less due to the shocking realization about where he was, and had much more to do with the fact it was as hard to keep his eyes open as it was to breathe through his nose. As bad as the smell was, his eyes felt as though someone had been continuously cutting onions in the surroundings. The irritation was so bad that Lionel was legitimately worried he might lose his eyesight if he kept them open too wide. Lionel, Aina and little Blackstar were actually at the bottom of a tall pit. Up above, there was a hole to the sky, and the air current of this pit all seemed to be converging toward this location to be filtered upward. Looking around, Lionel realized that this wasn't actually a pit but was actually a lot like a hive with deeply interconnected tunnels, all with exits a lot like this one. The hole to the sky didn't seem to have any simple way to be used, and even the closest edge of the hole was 300 meters above his head. Lionel couldn't even dream of jumping that distance, especially since the gravity here is so heavy. Even compared to the Void Palace, which was difficult to deal with in and of itself, this place was at least double that. But Lionel quickly shook his head. There was no guarantee that this wasn't the Void Palace. But my ability, Lionel shook his head. There was no point in speculating until he found out more information. The goal here was clear: to survive and reach a certain destination. To do such a thing, he couldn't speculate, he needed facts. Allowing a bias to color his deductions would just make finding the truth slower. Lionel released Aina, observing her intently. He didn't need to worry too greatly though. In just a few seconds, she seemed to have regained her bearings as well. The first thing she did, not much unlike Lionel, was look around, covering her nose with her hands. "This is a nest," she suddenly said. "This smell, though it's disgusting, it's coming from something that's highly nutritious, albeit disgusting to eat." Lionel's brows shot up. With Aina's ability, she had a keen sense for nutrition. Not only was she able to naturally tell how best to train her body, but she also knew exactly how to concoct the sort of nutrients she needed to supplement her body as well. This was what made her natural talent as a force pill crafter so high, and why she had been so greatly valued by Valiant Heart Mountain. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net the fact that her ability could be used like this was still a bit of a surprise to Lionel. Maybe this mutation of hers as a half-blood wasn't as inferior as Lionel had previously concluded. Lionel couldn't take out the dictionary in this place. The anarchic force in this region even higher than it had been beyond the walls of Village 0012. It was to the point that even Lionel's ability was no longer at Tier 4 in this place. "Do you know what it's a nest of?" Lionel asked. "No, I'm not sure. I only vaguely have the instinct that it's an egg." Lionel nodded. There didn't seem to be any immediate danger in the surroundings. However, Lionel knew this couldn't possibly last long. He had felt the teleportation try and separate himself and Aina. If not for his quick action, they would have been thrown apart. That told Lionel that there was no more hand-holding and teaming up designed for this trial. They had truly thrown them off the deep end. But likewise, because they had chosen to do this, it was likely that the elders were aware that the danger wouldn't be immediate either. "Wise Star Order, what do you know about this place?" "It is indeed a nest. If I were you, I would probably start running. There's no way they haven't already sensed such a mass teleportation. And the ones assigned to guard nests like these are nothing like those middling soldiers you've been fighting until this point." Almost as though to confirm Wise Star Order's words, a wild scream resonated through the hive, following the air currents of rushing foul smells, and making Lionel feel almost as though his eardrums might burst. The howl was like a furious battle cry and a sonorous warning, echoing all before the earth began to quake. Lionel's pupils constricted, his jaw steeling and his lips being drawn into a thin line. The Void Palace sure seemed to like to play games. They had actually been teleported into a Raypack's nest. Oh, I forgot to mention one other thing. The Raypacks like to build their nests in harsh environments, so that only the strong amongst their young survive. You've probably guessed it already, but this is a Void battlefield. Trying to leave here and return to a Void Palace stronghold won't be easy for a fairly simple reason. The Raypacks are probably the least of your concerns in a place like this. Chapter 1330. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:44 and 8 seconds p.m. Chapter 1330. Senate. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1330. Senate. We need to move. Aina nodded toward Lionel's words, and they both shot in the opposite direction of the roar. Neither of them were fools. The pressure of that roar alone cleared the fifth dimension. That told them one very obvious thing. This wasn't a perfectly curated trial with their limits in mind. This was a real life and death crisis. What Aina, Lionel, and the other youths didn't know was that this sudden change had led to a furious uproar in the Void Palace. Bang! Who sanctioned this? The roar shook the mountain range. Birds flew out in fear and a small avalanche of small rocks and dust tumbled downward. For such a scene to occur within a world at the pinnacle of the seventh dimension, it could only be said that this person was not only furious, but they also wielded power beyond the imagination of most. The location wasn't as one might expect, and was rather within a governmental body of the Void Palace, a step below the Elder Legion that sent Cornelius on his mission to monitor Lionel. The structure of the Void Palace was impossibly complex, filled with numerous factions, each with their own grudges and histories that could stretch back hundreds to even thousands of years. It could even be said that the Void Palace itself was like its own separate ecosystem and world, diverging from reality. The Void Legion elders could be considered to be the pinnacle of the powers of the Void Palace. They were the backbone, and their moniker was a reminder that their duty wasn't just to oversee, but was also to act as the strongest line of defense. This chapter upload first at novelbin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Beneath the Void Legion elders there was the Void Council. This was the current location, and was located on the second tallest peak of the Void Palace. The Void Council, also called the Senate, was made up of Void senators from across disciplines and factions. The major decisions and rules that all those who came here abided by were drafted and put into law by the Void Council and their Void senators. Unsurprisingly, with this sort of setup, the details of the true selection were also drafted up by the Void Council, or so it should have been. But it was either this infuriated Void senator was ignorant to a decision made without him, or one of the factions had gone rogue. The one who had spoken was a middle-aged man with strength already into the 7th dimension. Without at least such level of strength, he would have never been capable of causing such a commotion. But it was also this strength that made it so impressive that the Senate managed to keep its structural integrity, only swaying side to side slightly. This man was Uramus, and was the current party leader of the stalwart Polarm Party. He was a well-respected man, as he had to be to earn such a position. And right this moment he was absolutely furious. What was shocking, though, was that other than his party members, there didn't seem to be anyone else as infuriated as he was. Seeing such a scene, Uramus' chest heaved, his almost crimson gaze sweeping through the enormous Senate hall as though searching for his prey. He tried to meet the gazes of several other party leaders, but all he received in return was a shift of gaze and a glimpse into a guilty conscience. At that moment, a chuckle echoed through the Void Council. A man a head taller and a large measure skinnier than Uramus walking in as though he was gliding on clouds. "Rosen, this was your doing?" Uramus' voice boomed. Despite the seemingly embarrassing situation he had been in just moments before, he didn't seem to notice in the slightest. The veins across his forehead threatened to pop. Rosen was yet another party leader, however his was known as the Unfettered Blade Party. It could be said that of all the parties here, the history between these two was not only the deepest, it also held some of the deepest grudges. "You shouldn't be frowning all the time like this, Uramus. It's not good for your skin. You already look much older than you should. Don't tell me you want to look even worse." This chapter upload first at novelbin.net. "I'm not here for your petty games, Rosen. Who decided to send a batch of fresh meat to the Void battlefield? Are you insane? They've barely adapted to the lowest level anarchic force of the mountain base. Now you want them to adjust to an environment that's tenfold worse? This isn't training, it's sending them to their deaths. If I didn't know better, I would think that you had long since left the side of the human domain. This is our most promising generation in countless selections, yet you want to ruin them like this." Rosen's eyes narrowed, his playful demeanor becoming dark and as sharp as a blade. "I would advise you choose your words more carefully, Uramus. There are certain things you can't get away with saying even if you are a brute. Bite me, you piece of shit. If it wasn't for the rules restricting me within the Senate, I would have already blasted your head into chunks of watermelon. Why don't you step outside and see how I'll deal with you?" Rosen chuckled coldly. "It seems that you're only so brazen because you haven't realized your predicament just yet. An air-headed fool like you really would take too long to notice the crux of the issue here. Under your shared majority, you've led the Senate into the trash heap, and it's about time that stop." Uramus' expression changed, suddenly realizing something. "You dare?" Rosen sneered. "You've been voted out. Pack your things and scram. The stalwart Polarm Party has been demoted back to a faction. Take those trash you call subordinates with you." Uranus froze, feeling as though he had been struck by lightning. What the hell was going on? Announcement below. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1331. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:44 and 6 seconds p.m. Chapter 1331. Zavnik, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1331. Zavnik Uranus stood outside the tall bronze doors of the Senate in a daze, not quite knowing what had just happened. He didn't even know how to wrap his mind around this. The stalwart Polarm Party had been a party for over 800 years. They had been a majority or shared majority within the Senate for over 300. And yet, they had been demoted back down to a faction. Just like that, Uranus suddenly couldn't feel rage anymore. What he felt wasn't helplessness either. Rather, he felt guilt. Guilty that a legacy that had lasted so long actually suffered such humiliation at his hands. It had to be understood that factions were a very important part of the Void Palace. The Void Palace wasn't just for training youths, it was forging the future leaders of the human domain. As such, factions here represented something very different than it otherwise would. There were several levels to factions. Rookie factions, bronze factions, silver factions, gold factions, legacy factions, and finally, parties. From rookie to gold was fairly straightforward. They separated power based on the strength of their leadership, their accomplishments, their number of members, their average strength, so on and so forth. A legacy faction was a bit different. It wouldn't necessarily be stronger than a gold faction, however, it had been passed on and survived more than a single generation. This would happen when the leader of a faction promoted to greater ranks, left to enter a party, or was granted a title by a party. This wouldn't be considered a betrayal. In fact, a legacy faction would gain great prestige if their leader was recruited by a party. There were only 999 Senate seats, and a limited number of parties could claim them depending on their feats of strength. A faction promoting to a party was extraordinarily rare, so rare, in fact, that it might only occur once every few hundred years. As such, the most talented of faction leaders would choose to take this route. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. Finally, there was the level of parties. Parties were those who held the truest power within the Void Palace to the point where they could assert control over the rules that governed everyone. Parties were split into minority parties, majority parties, and shared majority parties. There were also special ranks among these parties, for example, the party whip who was tasked with maintaining order, organizing votes, and other things of the like. Minority parties were unironically the majority of parties. They could control anywhere from one seat to a few. Majority parties were parties that controlled at least 500 seats, giving them de facto majority on all decisions regardless of how everyone else voted. Shared majorities were a bit trickier. They could refer to a single party which controlled less than 500 seats, and as such might be overruled by the combined effort of all other parties. Or in this case, it could refer to two or more clashing behemoths. The Unfettered Blade Party and Stalwart Polarm Party both controlled over 500 seats between them. As such, if the two parties agreed on anything, there was nothing the other parties could do. But that was exactly the reason for the latter's downfall. There were too many parties looking for a method to finally breathe and break through. The fall of a giant would result in an uprising in competition. They had been stifled for too long. Even now, Uranus had no idea how such a thing had happened. The rulebook of Void Senators was far too long, and he couldn't be bothered to read all of it. He had thought that because they controlled 244 seats, no one could even dream of ousting them all at once like this. And yet, how could he not feel incompetent? His number one enemy had demoted them all the way from a shared majority party down to a legacy faction, and he didn't even know how they had done it. Uranus listlessly stared up into the sky. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. Hours later, Rosen sat in his office. The Void Council Hall wasn't just made up of its gathering location, but also doubled as the main base of most parties. As the current sole shared majority leader, he was feeling very content. However, his expression was quite calm. And then the door opened. Rosen's gaze narrowed, but didn't rise, nor did he seem too surprised. The young man that walked in did so leisurely, his expression not wavering in the face of Rosen's aura in the slightest despite clearly being several levels weaker. The young man was handsome, his overly chiseled jaw being a hallmark of his looks. His skin was bronzed, as was his hair, a pair of hazel eyes acting as the centerpiece of it all. He was tall, standing at least 7 feet, and his back was as straight as a javelin. Every one of his steps was measured, and his every movement wasted not the slightest hint of energy. In one glance, you might believe this young man to be a scholar, but in the next you might believe him to be a general. It was impossible to pinpoint accurately. It seems that you've taken my advice. Congratulations, shared Majority Leader Rosen. The young man smiled, taking a seat across from Rosen. Whether it was by his actions or by his words, even in the face of this lofty seventh-dimensional existence, he seemed to innately feel as though they were already equals. No, maybe that was just him giving Rosen some face. If the young man had his way, he might look down on the entire world. Despite only being within the 6th dimension, he had forced his seniors to dance on the palm of his hands. And even facing them now, he had no desire, nor the need, to be humble. Rosen stared at this young man deeply, not answering immediately. It was difficult to tell what it was he was thinking until he actually spoke. It seems the Morales family has an excellent pool of candidates this time around. Isn't that right, young heir Zavnik? Chapter 1332. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:44 and 5 seconds p.m. Chapter 1332. More questions. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1332. More questions. Zavnik chuckled. Why do you make it sound like I'm the only one that benefits from this arrangement? It can't be you've already forgotten how much you've earned just from this alone? Rosen sat back in his chair, still staring as though he had already forgotten how to speak. He wasn't normally a man of such few words, but facing this boy, he seemed to have become a mute. Since things are like this, it might be best if we lay out all the cards. We've been speaking through coded phrases and tacit head nods for too long. Don't take this as my insulting your intelligence. I simply want the line to be drawn as cleanly as possible. You gain the right to change the rules of the true selection as you deem fit, the greatest control over the Senate's actions for at least the next few decades, and you've also given your rising star an advantage over the competition. When Zavnik said these last words, Rosen's pupils constricted, though his heart remained steady and his expression remained indifferent. Even for a person like him, there were certain ingrained reflexes that couldn't be easily circumvented. It seemed that he had still underestimated this brat a bit too much. He had thought that Zavnik would try to humor him a bit, but who would have thought that he had something like this up his sleeves? There's no need to be so surprised, Senior. It was a bit obvious, don't you think? Why would the mighty unfettered Blade Party risk falling from the good graces of the Void Elder Legion and offending so many powerful families and organizations just for the sake of sending a batch of youthful geniuses to their deaths? A lesser person might really believe that Senior was a traitor of the human race, wanting to cripple this generation. But you know something that most don't, right? Zavnik smiled. I was racking my brain, trying to figure out what reason you could possibly have. I decided to think outside of the box. Rather than assuming the obvious and believing you to be a traitor, I made the assumption that this benefited you in ways that were rooted outside of just a weakening of the human race. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. At the same time, I realized that this might have been a death sentence for most other years, but considering the talent of this generation, it was more likely that such a challenge would result in casualties no greater than any other year, so it would balance itself out. And that was when I stumbled onto a clue. I heard your family has a young one that calls himself the Sword Deity? Zavnik smiled meaningfully, looking toward Rosen, who had already regained his composure. From the first sentence Zavnik had spoken, he had already expected much of the rest of this. It's quite interesting. Being a Void Palace disciple gives you access to a whole other world, but the restrictions are heavy. You can't even set foot onto a Void battlefield until after having accumulated enough merits, And if you fail to gain access to one fast enough, you get punished with demotion nonetheless. It's an odd push and pull where on one hand, it looks like everyone is coddling you too much, and on the other, they want to thrust you off to your death. I've heard, though, that the situation of your sword family is a bit precarious. The tribulation of sword domain is coming you very quickly, but the inheritor of this generation hasn't grown up yet. In a situation like yours, I would be stressed out as well. Unfortunately, your sword deity isn't much of one just yet. Unlucky if you ask me. But you're trying your best. The Void Battlefield is the most unique opportunity there is for your sword deity, as it represents more than just a death trap. However, you simultaneously also needed a reason to use the Void Palace's resources for your own personal gain without breaking any rules. We all know that the Void Battlefield is a land of death to some, but to a select few, it can be a land of opportunity. You know, as a Morales, I never really liked swordsmen. You're all quite annoying to me. However, for the sake of my goals, it seems I have no choice but to help out the enemy. The only unfortunate thing is that while I understand this much, I still don't know how much you could possibly gain from this. I wonder what target your sword deity has that's so important that he must risk his life in this way, and can't wait just a few years to be led onto the battlefield naturally. Zavnik scanned Rosen's expression, but could only sigh when he didn't receive the answer he was looking for at a glance. It seemed that his deductions would come to an end here, but he didn't seem to be too disappointed. In fact, his smiling expression was still very much there. Suddenly, Rosen smiled. This chapter upload first at novelbin.net. Do you believe that you're the only one with deductive abilities? I personally found it very interesting when I heard that there were only 2 amethyst tokens given out this year. That's quite a low number, don't you think? Zavnik chuckled. It is quite a low number. So imagine how surprised I was when I found out my littlest cousin is among them? Rosen's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. Zavnik was too calm. If his goal was truly to kill Lionel, he should be sweating buckets. Such a large movement wouldn't fool that man. Oh, you thought I wanted to kill littlest Nova? What kind of big brother would I be if I planned all of this out to do that? My goals are much higher than that. I wasn't even aware that littlest Nova would be joining with this batch until just a few hours ago. By then, all of this had already been set into motion. Zavnik sighed. It can only be said that littlest Nova is unlucky. Or maybe he's quite lucky. I guess it would depend on the outcome, don't you think? Rosen's gaze narrowed firmer. Zavnik stood. Well, this is unfortunate. I wanted to have this meeting so that we could clear the air. But it seems that we'll be ending this meeting with more questions than answers. Zavnik smiled lightly and walked toward the door. Have a nice day, Senior. With a light click, the door closed. What was the purpose of the sword deity on the Void Battlefield? What was so important that Rosen would risk public ire to allow him this chance? Zavnik had no idea. But on the other hand, what was Zavnik's goal? Why would he, as a polearm wielder himself, cripple the strongest party capable of backing him? Rosen had no idea. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1333. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:44 and 4 seconds p.m. Chapter 1333. One rule: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1333. One rule. Zavnik walked out of the Senate with a light smile on his face, his expression carefree. He walked by the straggling members of the stalwart polearm party without a word, none of them being aware that the young man who had put them in such a state was right before them. He strolled down the pathways, his demeanor remaining the same. However, when he reached a patch of forest, his steps suddenly paused. It was you, wasn't it? The voice came from a shadow hidden behind a tree. Despite the fact Zavnik was at most a meter away, it was still difficult to see this person, as though they had perfectly fused into the shadows. Still, Zavnik didn't seem to have a very hard time telling who it was. Smiling lightly, Zavnik shook his head. I'm not sure what you mean. The voice remained silent for a long while, but Zavnik didn't move either. It was as though the both of them had entered a state of tacit silence, each probing the other as though to check to see which of them was bluffing more than the other. I have to say, it's quite an excellent move. First Nova was just on the verge of becoming a core member of the stalwart polearm party, and now he's effectively wasted more than a decade of effort. Fourth Nova also just managed to gain their favor and promote his faction to a legacy faction as well. If this was you, you've quite effectively crippled two of them. Zavnik chuckled. Even if it was me, your conclusion would be too exaggerated, don't you think? Crippling First Nova with just a single move? Is that even possible? Your attempts at probing me are just as terrible as they always are, Second Nova. We both know First Nova well enough to understand that this isn't a setback, it's an opportunity on a silver platter. So why would I ever do that? Indeed. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. Despite not being able to see Second Nova's face, the narrowing of his gaze was practically palpable. The crippling of the stalwart polearm party might sound like a terrible plight for First Nova, but that was only if their eldest Nova was incompetent. The only one to truly suffer from this was Fourth Nova, but he was actually foolish enough to follow in the same path as First Nova, as though there would be scraps to pick up and make use of. He had no one to blame but himself. With the regression of a party back to a legacy faction, especially a party with such deep roots and foundations, there would be a chance to capitalize. The heads of former management would likely roll, and that would allow new voices to bloom where they would otherwise not have a single chance. So Zavnik was perfectly correct. First Nova would actually greatly benefit from this. And that was exactly why, though it seemed Second Nova was sure that Zavnik had acted, there was actually no way to tell. Because the motive was simply too murky. Even he couldn't tell exactly what Zavnik's purpose would be if he had done this. And that made it all the more serious. The struggle between swordmen and spearmen was a tale as old as time itself. The push and pull of both factions had gone back and forth for too long. Even though most of the Morales brothers hadn't chosen to join the stalwart polearm party, because First Nova had already staked his claim upon it, that didn't mean that they didn't benefit from the stalwart polearm party in other ways. Polearm wielders fell under the former party's umbrella of protection. With their fall, the changes would start subtly, but they could very well eventually snowball. It would start with less materials capable of manufacturing polearms being procured. Then it would lead to less spears overall being forged. Then it would lead to less investment in the discipline overall, less techniques created, less training rooms maintained, and eventually, you would look up one day and there would be less polearm geniuses overall. These would all be small, almost insignificant changes in the short term, but in the long term, and on a large scale, it would soon become an avalanche. This would just be the tip of the iceberg. Second Nova wouldn't be surprised to see more sword fanatics in positions of power very soon, making life a living hell for those at the very bottom. This was the second reason why Second Nova just couldn't reconcile this matter. The grudge between the Morales family and the Sword family, the kings of the spear and the kings of the sword, was just as deep as the grudge between the Morales family and the Force Crafters Guild. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. There were no small number of Morales family members who were active members of the stalwart polearm party, and it was likewise for the Sword family and the Unfettered Blade party. Crippling the former would be like Zavnik shooting himself in the foot. None of it made sense. It's been a nice talk, Oren. Zavnik smiled lightly. You should really get rid of that habit of sneaking up on people. I'm used to it already, but what will littlest Nova think? Oren fell into silence for a moment before he responded. You weren't targeting our littlest brother, were you? His voice seemed to carry a hint of cold to it that hadn't been there before. Though Seventh Nova was the least threatening of them all due to his late start, he was also the greatest variable purely due to who his father was. With a wild card in play, maybe someone smart would prefer to take him out before he could grow. Zavnik, though, let out an exasperated sigh. Why did everyone think he was a murderer? Actually, he was a murderer. Just not one that would target his own family, and definitely not one that would target someone who was effectively his baby brother. You think my information network is better than yours? You tell me when you found out he would be here, and if you'd have enough time to plan this in that span. These words were simple, and Zavnik had already begun to walk past the tree as he spoke them. But they also seemed to relax Oren a great deal. It seemed that Oren would allow Zavnik to simply disappear. But in the end he still got in another word. Third Nova, you're walking a thin line here. There's only ever been one rule for the Air Wars. Don't choose power over family. Zavnik chuckled. I'll keep that in mind, Second Nova. Chapter 1334. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:44 and 2 seconds p.m. Chapter 1334. Fast if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1334. Fast bang. A violent mouthful of blood shot out from Lionel's lips, his eyeballs threatening to pop out of their sockets, even as all the air that had once been in his lungs was forcefully ripped out, as though by the hands of a menacing god. The impact he felt against the opposing wall was just as devastating. If it wasn't for the improvement to his metal body, he would have experienced what it felt like to have all the bones in his body crushed at once. Lionel! Aina's part enraged, part worried cry resonated through the cave walls, both her and Little Blackstar leaping to action. Son of a bitch! Lionel coughed and wheezed, trying to quickly regain his bearings. The group of three had just begun to run, realizing the kind of trouble they were in. If they allowed themselves to be pinned down by the Rapax, their deaths would be practically inevitable. Their goal, first and foremost, was definitely to get out of the range of the location they had teleported into as quickly as possible. That way, even if the Rapax knew there were invaders, they would have a harder time finding them. Who could have expected, though, for them to hardly have traveled 50 meters before running into their first altercation? If not for Lionel's sturdy body, he would have already ended up blasted into bits and pieces of flesh and blood. Lionel only had himself to blame. He took the lead and rushed forward, protecting Aina and Little Blackstar to his back. But so confident in his internal sight and sense of danger, he rounded a corner, only to find a vicious straight leg kick waiting for his sternum. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Lionel had obviously not accounted for the most pressing thing. Or rather, it was difficult to do so. Internal sight was useless against Rapax. Because his sense of hearing had been impaired by the previous screech, and because of the all-encompassing, grotesque scent that filled the hive nest, Lionel had no way of hearing it coming nor smelling the distinct scent of the Rapax, landing him in such a situation. He could feel his ribcage bow and flex, almost snapping at its hinges entirely. He had never been more happy that his metal body had undergone such drastic improvements until now. The instant Lionel crashed against an opposing wall, he activated his bronze runes in full force, dispersing the strength of the impact across his entire body before he fell to the ground, his head spinning. I have to adjust. Locking onto Rapax is impossible. At least not until I can figure out a way to circumvent their natural protections. However, it's impossible that Rapax wouldn't affect their environment. Start dream simulation. Lionel's mind began to work at top speeds. Although he no longer had access to Tier 4 abilities, dream simulation didn't have such high requirements. The fact that it was one of the first abilities Lionel had created for himself spoke for itself. Quickly, Lionel went through his memory bank of battles with Rapax. He organized their movement patterns, their gait, their general impact on the environment around them. In the blink of an eye, he had finished and created a new pseudo-dream counter ability. He couldn't use the real dream counter as it was a Tier 4 ability he had created capable of triggering a reaction in his body without his explicit input. But he could use the principle of assigning a mind to a task just the same now. It was just that he would have to constantly divert overt attention to it. Lionel adjusted the way he used internal psi from a general sweep of the surroundings to a focused and dialed-in intention toward certain parameters. His thought process was simple. The Rapax could hide themselves from internal sight, but they couldn't hide themselves from the environment. If this was a grassy land, the process would be simple. Just look for imprints in the grass. Unfortunately, there was nothing but dry stone everywhere. However, this wouldn't impede Lionel in the slightest. Their tails swish at a certain cadence. Look for regular patterns in the wind. Wind is too unpredictable to have such measurable and constant repetition. Their bodies are heavy, though slight and almost impossible to detect. As they move, so will the ground tremor. It's difficult to detect their distinct smell in such an environment, but it's still possible to if I'm looking for distinct signatures with my internal sight. This chapter upload first at Novel Bin. Lionel went out to list at least 100 other parameters, tweaking them to the point they fit in perfectly with the environment they were in, and all completed before he fell to a knee sinking down from the wall he had been smashed against. "Oh, call you dream detect." Lionel's head snapped upward, his gaze having regained its sharpness. He completed all of his calculations in a near instant, in time to see that there was just a single Rapax before them. This Rapax, though, was of Tier 9 of the 5th dimension, and its kick was no joke at all. Kill it before it can call for reinforcements, Lionel said quickly. Aina didn't say a word herself. She spun on her heels, her axe glowing with lethality. The Rapax, whose leg had just descended from its assault on Lionel, reacted quickly. Closing in the distance, it rose a knee to the skies, aiming to deflect and quickly counter. It was a combination that Lionel had seen many times. The Rapax loved to use their knees for defense as it could be retracted much faster than a kick. However, it was then that Lionel, who the Rapax likely thought would be out for a moment, sprung to action. His speed blazing as a trail of star force followed his path. The Rapax reacted almost instantly. Canceling its thoughts at countering, it fell back. Unfortunately, it hadn't seen that there was a third member of their party until it was far too late. Little Black Star appeared to the Rapax's back, his little claws glowing with a dangerous light. With striking precision, Lionel's punch and Black Star's claw landed at the same time, forcing the Rapax to take the full brunt of both. Little Black Star's claw ripped right through tender flesh, severing the Rapax's head from its body. "I don't think this was a coincidence." Lionel spoke before the corpse even fell. "We need to move fast, or else we'll be surrounded." The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1335. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:44 p.m. Chapter 1335. Fertilizer. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1335. Fertilizer. With a thought, Lionel sent the Rapax corpse into the segmented cube. The one advantage they would have in all of this would be the size of their spatial treasures. The space Lionel had access to was practically unlimited. Like this, they would leave the least amount of traces behind that could be used to quickly find them. And this would also help Lionel bolster the resources he could use with the tentacle womb. However, none of this was the reason Lionel's brows were so furrowed. "I have a feeling that the reason they separated us during the teleportation was less about the Void Palace being sadistic, and more about them giving us a lifeline." When Aina heard this, she too frowned. She didn't need Lionel to explain anything else. They had been found far too quickly. Lionel had learned to minimize his mistakes in battle to a great degree as he gained more experience. Something like being caught off guard like that was rare for him at this stage. And yet, it had happened, all because Lionel had missed this very key detail. If Lionel was correct, teleporting them all individually kept the fluctuations to an absolute minimum. This way, the likelihood they would be spotted and found would be drastically lessened. Ironically, if separation had been part of the test itself, the Void Palace would have probably put more effort into making sure Lionel couldn't ignore the rules. But because it was only for safety measures, ignoring it hadn't been nearly as difficult. After reaching this point in his thought process, Lionel really had no idea whether he should be cursing himself or the Void Palace. In fact, why not do both? He had really stepped in shit this time. Still, regardless of how dangerous this is, there's still a chance to benefit. If this is a nest, then that means that there's probably a spot here where a ton of high-level Rapax are born. It would probably be a death sentence to fight a fully matured high-class Rapax, or rather a ruined Rapax, like Wise Star Order calls them. But what about a baby that hadn't quite been born yet? The DNA is the same. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Lionel slotted this thought into the back of his mind. His first intention had to be to escape this place, or to find a viable exit. This could only take second place. The nest regions would definitely be the most highly guarded, Trying to steal something from there, especially one of their more talented seedlings, would be like throwing himself into a pit of fire. Survival came first and foremost. Benefits came as a very far-off secondary option. As they ran, Lionel's gaze flickered, taking in everything. He memorized the routes they were taking, but he was also paying close attention to the enormous holes above their head. Every so often, they would run beneath a large opening to the outside world reaching at least 300 meters above their heads. Jumping that distance was out of the question. However, it might still be possible for Lionel to use his wings to fly that distance. The trouble was that Lionel didn't believe doing such a thing would be smart. From Lionel and Anna's perspective, these holes represented an opportunity to escape. But if you look at it from the perspective of Arapax, each one of these holes was a security concern. And with such a security concern, there would obviously be guardians overseeing it. Simply put, it was definitely more dangerous on the surface than it was within the nest. If they wanted to make use of these holes to escape, they had to find a point near the edge, furthest from the store of what Lionel assumed must be eggs. Only in that way would he be able to take such a risk. In that case, even if there were guards above, there would be fewer than one might expect nearer the center of the territory. Anna seemed to understand this as well and didn't question Lionel's choice. Instead, they all followed the wind, moving with it toward a hopeful exit. The flow of the wind seemed to be ventilating this smell. This should be why the flow is greatest beneath the holes. If we follow the wind until it weakens considerably, we should then be nearer the outskirts of the hive and be in a safer position to move up to the surface. Lionel felt that his deduction was correct, but he still reached out to Wise Star Order. In the end, the old man confirmed his thoughts. This chapter upload first at novelbin.net. The smell isn't from what you think it's from. The Rapax had a very different culture from humans, and don't like wastage. After a warrior dies, rather than being buried, they become fertilizer for the next generation. The more talented the lineage of the batch, the stronger dead warriors become the fertilizer for their growth. In their incubation stage, the eggs absorb nutrients from this fertilizer. Unfortunately, what's left behind after the eggs are done is highly toxic. I don't need to tell you that corpses are hotbeds for illness and disease. So nests of Rapax have to be very well ventilated. Lionel frowned. That's true even for higher dimensional corpses as well? Of course. Don't you still need to sleep, shit and shower? Do you think that stops? At best, you'll just need to do less of it. You don't transcend mortality. That's fantasy nonsense. Seventh dimensional corpses just take a bit longer to rot. And with the methods of the Rapax, they can speed up the process to help their young along. If anything, the toxins and diseases that can latch onto higher dimensional corpses are even worse. I would be very careful of corpse poison if I were you. I know a fool like you probably wants to go and take advantage of this situation, but not to mention the fact those guarding the main lineage nests are far stronger than you can imagine. It even requires their level of strength to stand in those areas without dying to a single whiff of the air. Lionel's blood ran cold when he heard this. The trio rounded yet another corner, heading further and further toward their destination. However, Lionel felt like his hair was still standing on end. That original screech that sent them running still replayed in his mind. It had most definitely not come from the Rapax they killed. Ha! Lionel came to a grinding halt, his gaze sharpening toward a particular region. At that moment, a familiar little violet puppy quivered. Chapter 1336. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 59 seconds p.m. Chapter 1336. This way if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1336. This way Lionel's expression flickered. He recognized the little puppy almost instantly. It was the very same little beast that had been following behind Simona. Clearly, the little one had gotten separated from its owner during the forced teleportation. Why is it quivering though? A beast that could follow her around shouldn't be so cowardly. Lionel frowned, making the decision to turn away. Even if this beast was cowardly, there was no way that it was weak. And at this level, beasts should definitely have intelligence no weaker than an average human, some even surpassing this level. He couldn't just randomly pick up a puppy for no reason. Shockingly, though, Lionel didn't get a chance to walk away before Aina appeared before the little one. Bending over to pick it up, the little puppy dodged backward, its speed confirming Lionel's thoughts. Just the fact this little beast could survive so well within this thick anarchic force spoke for itself. There was no way that it was weak. Don't tell me that. Lionel felt a headache coming along. His father often said things about women that would end up with him sleeping on the couch if his mother was around. Among those things was his disdain with their fascination with cute things. Now that Lionel thought about it, everything his dad said about female nature was probably another trick he used to lure another into his bed. Lionel usually rolled his eyes when his dad said such things. But if Aina was really doing this for the sake of cuteness, it seemed he would have to give his old man a point in his favor. This definitely wasn't the time to be soft-hearted. Lionel still remembered that the first time he met little Blackstar he tried to kill him. Luckily, the little one was practically invulnerable to attack. Though Lionel recalled feeling exasperated at the time. Now this situation felt eerily similar. It's okay, little guy. Just come with me. Aina smiled a beautiful smile, her golden irises twinkling. This chapter upload first at NovelBin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext. Com to experience faster update speed. The little purple puppy hesitated. But under Aina's coaxing, and likely a bit of her mental coercion, the little one was forced into her arms. Lionel's internal sight continuously swept through the surroundings as far as it could go. His range was even less here than it was in the forest previously. If not for his breakthrough in the heavenly body realm, he might have trouble stretching it past just his skin. Aina rose from the ground with the puppy in her arms. Right then, she suddenly tossed it through the air at Lionel. Put it in a snow globe. Though Lionel was caught off guard, his reaction speed was very fast. Before the little puppy could react, it was trapped in a frozen time loop, unable to do much of anything except enter a deep sleep. Lionel raised an eyebrow. What? Aina asked. Did you think I stopped because it was adorable? With this, shall owe you a favor. Lionel speechlessly watched as Aina turned and broke out into a sprint once again. As he followed, he couldn't help but wonder if he was having a bad influence on her. Or if she was always this savage. Something was telling him that it was the latter. A third-party observer would definitely look at Lionel like he was an idiot. It wasn't the countless people she had decapitated with her axe that made her savage, but rather tricking a puppy into a benign cage that was? It was either he was blind or a love-struck fool. Lionel's lip couldn't help but curl upward. It was hard to tell if he even realized it was happening. Right then, the pair came to a grinding halt. A fork lay ahead, making it difficult to tell which direction to go. It wasn't the first time they had come across a fork. However, before, the direction of the wind had made it easy to decide which way to go. This time, though, both paths seemed identical wind-wise, and they didn't have enough information about where they were in the hive to make a decision based on the direction either. This chapter upload first at NovelBin.net. Lionel stopped by Aina's side, his brow furrowed. He took deep, steady breaths, ignoring the foul smell in the air. Is it possible based on smell? Lionel asked. Aina had said that she was very sensitive to these things, so maybe she had a general idea of where the nutritious nutrients she had sent before were. Even if it wouldn't be a 100% guarantee, they would just have to pick the direction opposite of it, and hope that the pathway didn't curl or turn oddly. Unfortunately, Aina shook her head. The strong winds override the natural movement of the scent a lot. There's no difference between following the wind and following the smell. Lionel nodded. He had expected as much. So it was a 50-50 chance, huh? Lionel very much doubted that both paths would lead to an exit. Or, even if they did both do so, he was certain that one would be safer than the other. Let's do it based on this, then. These nests probably need a large supply of water. Since we're guessing anyway, let's do it based on which direction has the weakest water force concentration. Aina's brows suddenly shot up. That's not a bad idea. But instead of doing it with water force, let me do it with life force. Lionel nodded. This was indeed the better idea. He had almost forgotten that one of Aina's main affinities was life force. It was already high before she removed her curse. He could only imagine what level it had risen to now. This way. Lionel didn't refute Aina. Logically, the location with the highest life force would be the direction of the core of the nest. Not only would it have the strongest warriors guarding it, but it would also have the Rapak's eggs. Every time the pair came across a fork, they would take the same approach. However, the uneasiness in Lionel's heart grew every time they did. Their frequency only seemed to increase. Chapter 1337. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 58 seconds p.m. Chapter 1337. This king if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1337. This king, what's going on here, old man? I've never been stupid enough to enter a Rapak's nest. How the hell would I know? Lionel's heart felt uneasy. It was like his heartbeat had gone hollow, ringing in his ears and sending an odd wave of something slightly less than pain through his chest. It wasn't quite piercing enough to harm him, but it was too great to ignore at the same time. The more uneasy Lionel became, the colder his gaze got. Eventually, they began to flicker with a smoldering flame, the temperature around him even rising for a moment. Aina shifted her eyes from the path ahead to land on Lionel's side profile. But not long after she did so, she found herself looking into his eyes. If it comes down to it and I try to bring you into the segmented cube, don't resist. Lionel spoke, his voice tinged with a hint of cold. Aina stared at Lionel deeply for a long while. It didn't seem like she would respond at all after a while. But when she finally did, her choice of words were like a baffling sledgehammer to Lionel's chest. I am stronger than you. Lionel, who hadn't looked away from Aina, continued to do so. Despite the fact the words should have been shocking, he didn't seem to react like it was at all. His pace didn't falter, his expression didn't change, and his heart seemed to have regained its calm bearing. Don't think that I'm just saying that to say that. Aina continued. I'm not making it up. Nor am I only stronger than you by a small measure. Aina didn't need to make it up. When her and Lionel's internal sights fused, she realized that her ability could be extended to others through this incredibly intimate action. Though not as detailed as when she used it on only herself, she could tell Lionel's deficiencies and had a vague idea of the path he could take to improve himself as well. Of course, she would never give this information to Lionel because of how vague it was. It could very well be skewed. But it was still enough for her to tell the gap between them. Lionel hadn't been joking when he said that Aina would be a greater challenge for him than Miguel would be. In fact, Lionel hadn't yet caught up to where Miguel would be at 100% since he had yet to catch up to Aina. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. I already know this. Lionel responded, his voice not wavering. Aina's brows furrowed. However, if I fought 10 people just as strong as you, I would still win 10 out of 10 times. Lionel's violet hair danced in the wind, a stronger tinge of purple suddenly suffusing within them. At that moment, Aina's furrowed brows slowly relaxed, her limbs becoming looser and her stride becoming wider. Her hair fluttered as well, a deep coercion reflecting all impurities from her body. Lionel looked ahead as well, exhaling a heated breath, his body seeming to glow. I really hate you, Aina suddenly said. Then why do you follow me? Lionel asked without missing a beat. Because I also love you, Aina replied, her tone even. A silence fell between the two. The sounds of their steps were so light that nothing of their passage was left behind. As for little Blackstar, he was even less of a problem, gliding through the air as though it was solid ground and vanishing into the void without the slightest issue like a fish on water. I love you too. Aina's eyes widened, her head suddenly snapping in Lionel's direction. But before she could react, she found a hand having appeared on her shoulder. Leon. Aina vanished into the segmented cube, just as Lionel rounded a final corner. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Aina stood in a daze within the expanse of the segmented cube for just a moment before her fury bubbled over. A violet rouge fog erupted around her, her hair grew to the length of a river, and her gaze became like a piercing dragon's. She roared, her rage so palpable that the garden around her was vanquished into an ashy pit under nothing other than the oppression and density of her force alone. The worst part about it all was that she couldn't tell whether she was more enraged by the fact Lionel had done this to her again, or if it was because she had no idea whether Lionel had meant those words he had just said, or had just used them as a method to distract her into not resisting. Anna's head rose into the skies, roaring at what felt like nothing. She broke through another tear, entering tear 6, and yet she didn't seem to notice in the slightest. Lionel stood on the other side of the corner, his breathing steady and his gaze cold. What he saw across from him, though, was enough to make almost anyone else's heart freeze over. The ruined Raypax stood as though it had been waiting all along. Though its demeanor was different from a human's, Lionel could still feel the air of nonchalance around it. Even after noticing Lionel, it hardly reacted. It stood in place, its body as unwavering as a mountain. Its body was an entire meter taller than the Raypax Lionel was used to, standing at 4 meters even with its overly slouched back. The very same silver plates danced across its body. However, there was a very distinct difference here. All across its plated armor, dense, swirling tattoos of black could be found, giving it both a profound air of majesty and a secondary air of oppression and warlike violence. Lionel's veins pumped with a reddish gold, his skin beginning to glow as bronze runes awakened all across his body. With every exhale, another heated fog would manifest until his body was coated from head to toe in a gorgeous silver and sky blue armor. Lionel could very clearly see the spurs that had begun to grow on its pill-shaped head. They were subtle and not too large, but they were enough to tell Lionel what he needed to know. Spurs on the tail denoted the 5th dimension. Spurs on the head, though, denoted the 6th. Lionel's force erupted. Come on, you alien piece of shit. This king has a beauty to protect. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1338. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 56 seconds p.m. Chapter 1338. Blind spot. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1338. Blind spot. Lionel's body erupted with a swirl of fog, a dense blackness, an oppressive violet, and a deep crimson. Without the slightest hesitation, he activated. Bang! The air around Lionel exploded, the oxygen around his feet releasing crackling booms of violent chain reactions as the flames within him ignited. It filled Lionel's body up to the brim with vital force, accelerating his healing factor, and pushing his body to the brink, pushed him past those limits. From the very beginning, combustion was meant to take advantage of Lionel's nodal pathway, igniting his blood and surrounding his heart in a wreath of flames. In this state, his body was at its very strongest. Give me everything you have. 2 orbs of crimson hovered in place of Lionel's eyes, the viciousness of his demeanor finally making the ruined Raypax somewhat more alert. Yip. Yip. Little Blackstar body seemed to double in size, his fur standing on end and his long whiskers jetting outward like finely pointed needles. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. However, under Lionel's orders, Little Blackstar didn't move at all. Hovering in the air, a strong surge of might came out from the little guy, suddenly causing the force in the surroundings to begin to increase in density, and the anarchic force to concentrate. Lionel had only given Blackstar a single command: make them choke on anarchic force. Bang! Lionel sent out 4 punches in quick succession, his forward momentum and the twist of his hips fusing as one to bear down upon the ruined Raypax. For this creature, who was very much used to its overbearing pressure severely weakening opponents it felt was far weaker than itself, this was something completely unexpected, resulting in Lionel's fists actually landing. The harsh sounds of metal banging against metal resonated through the air, ripples of concentrated wind and sparks of volatile flames flying off in every which direction. The ruined Raypax found itself sliding back against the stone ground, its large curled claws scraping against the ground and leaving behind shallow imprints. A short silence followed. The ruined Raypax head seemed to tilt downward, its gaze, or what Lionel thought was its gaze, looking down at the region where the latter's fists had landed. It seemed surprised that such an ant would actually dare to attack it. Or maybe it was surprised that it had actually been pushed back. The ruined Rapax looked back up. The silver shell that covered its head didn't seem to have any slits for eyes, making it difficult to tell if it was really looking at all. But the feeling, at least to Lionel, felt the exact same. Bang! Maybe the ruined Rapax had thought its nonchalant reaction would affect Lionel. Or maybe it thought that the intimidation of its growing and more serious aura would at least cause him to pause. Whatever the reason, the ruined Rapax stood unmoving as Lionel launched yet another series of attacks, seemingly just as baffled as the first time. Lionel didn't even seem to register the failure of his first volley of attacks. In fact, he only grew more furious, the relentless pursuit of a stronger and stronger attack barreling down upon the ruined Rapax. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net SS Gary. The movement of the ruined Rapax was so sudden and fast that Lionel only had the time to cross his arms above his head. Even replaying his perfect memory, Lionel couldn't find the image of the Rapax having raised its leg, and yet by the time he registered it, a vicious axe kick had nearly crumbled him to his knees from above. In inaction, the ruined Rapax had been as steady as a mountain. However, the moment it moved, it was like a relentless, explosive avalanche, the monstrosity of its attack power feeling like enormous implosions going off within Lionel's body. Even with his bronze runes fully activated, just this one attack alone made Lionel feel as though his body was collapsing. Still, even in such a situation, the fierce glow in Lionel's gaze didn't falter. In fact, despite their crimson hue, they seemed decidedly cold. Thoughts of everything else vanished, his entire mind focusing on the creature before him. Even without the ability to lock onto it with his internal sight, Lionel dissected everything he could, an eerie calm cooling his head. Blind spot. That was Lionel's ultimate conclusion. This Rapax was using a special style that took advantage of its innate ability to avoid detection of internal sight. Like this, it was able to levy attacks using speed and timing to make it seem as though it had practically teleported into place. This was exactly why, despite standing right before it, Lionel had somehow missed a leg raising into the air. It took Lionel just a single exchange to comprehend this, and he adjusted accordingly. Bang! Under the relentless pressure, Lionel's knees crashed in the ground, his forearms threatening to shatter entirely. However, almost the instant the ruined Rapax rose its leg, so too did Lionel rebound from the ground. It looked as though he had used the hard stone as a trampoline, fighting back against the strike of the ruined Rapax, just enough to have such an effect. The ruined Rapax had already prepared a second attack, but Lionel leapt over it, his knees tucking and his arms spreading out as though to balance himself in the air. If the ruined Rapax could display human emotions, its eyes would have most definitely widened even as its brows shot up. It had executed its technique perfectly. How had this human, clearly in such a bad situation, dodged? Lionel landed on the ground as light as a feather, his body exploding forth as he landed a vicious kick on the side of the ruined Rapax knee joint. He drilled everything he had into it, his vital force, destruction capabilities, and universal force all coming together to form a torrent of wind that even manifested from the other side of the ruined Rapax's tough shell as well. Chapter 1339. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 55 seconds p.m. Chapter 1339. Vessel. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1339. Vessel. Lionel didn't wait for the result of his attack. He instantly erupted with the full force of the heavenly body realm, rotating to the back of the ruined Rapax in one fluid motion. As expected, Lionel's attack wasn't nearly strong enough to snap the ruined Rapax's knee, but it was just enough for it to lose its balance while it had a leg in the air. And just as predicted, its tail quickly flickered, stabbing into the ground with a dull thump to keep it upright. Even for a sixth-dimensional ruined Rapax, stabbing through a ground of a seventh-dimensional world like this, especially one continuous tempered by the erosion of anarchic force, was a difficult task. The result was its scorpion-like tail catching a small bit of earth before slipping, only to quickly stab down again to achieve true balance. But by the time it had done this, Lionel was already to its back, his fists glowing like two radiant suns as a moon and planet appeared to his back. The moment they did, Lionel's dark ice domain erupted, making the ruined Rapax feel as though its body was stuck in limbo. Lionel's gaze flashed, his mind entirely focused on the tender flesh of the ruined Rapax. His star constructs shrunk down violently beneath his command, their strength concentrating into fine points as level 2 golden spear force manifest under Lionel's will. Bang! Bang! Scree-cree. Lionel drew blood, the spurt of bluish liquid reflecting in his irises as 2 holes appeared on either side of the ruined Rapax's spine. However, despite the minor victory, Lionel's expression didn't shift even the slightest bit. With smooth steps, he glided backward, dodging the whipping tail of the ruined Rapax. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novelnext.com to experience faster update speed with a thought. Lionel's meteor construct manifested. Following the momentum of the furiously whipping tail, the beam of metallic gold enveloped the scorpion-like spikes and increased its weight several-fold, causing the ruined Rapax to misjudge and overcorrect, veering its tail off course and out of its control for a few precious fragments of a second. Lionel's moon construct flashed, the ruined Rapax conceptualization of time dilating. In those moments, the ruined Rapax felt as though it had suddenly entered a dream. No matter how fast it ran, it wasn't fast enough. But, in this case, no matter how much strength it put into swinging its tail back after missing, it didn't seem like enough. The gorgeous white planet to Lionel's back layered this effect. While the moon attacked the ruined Rapax's mind, the planet construct attacked its physical body, fusing with the affecting of the meteor construct and pressing down with an oppressive gravity. The fluidity of Lionel's actions were seamless. One action rolled into the next, his mind working at warp speeds and his calculations becoming more and more precise with each passing second. The ruined Rapax found itself swinging from being off balance on one side to suddenly overcompensating, and being caught completely off balance toward another. It was right then that Lionel's second prepared attack flourished. His spear domain crown glowed, shimmering with a blinding golden light that washed the dark tunnels in a kingly might. His vital force brought his body to the very brink, the flame surrounding his heart forcing it to heat up and pound relentlessly. And finally, his forces fused into one, piling on top of one another relentlessly. Lionel had learned a lot about his spear domain lineage factor after his recent breakthrough. While it seemed like the only change was that his spear force had gone from a more normal and bland white color to a piercing gold, this was far from the case. Lionel had come to understand that while his spear force could be powerful on its own, it could also act as a vessel and conduit for his other strengths. Why was it that every spear domain spear felt so unique? Each had its own unique element or ability to it. Such a thing felt odd. Should they be more focused on the purity of the spear itself as a weapon? Why was it that some focused on water, others on fire, yet others on lightning or light? The answer to that was simple. From the very beginning, the spear domain lineage factor was capable of absorbing all things, becoming the foundation of a warrior's style no matter what kind of ability or other affinities they might have. So when Lionel fused his light elemental, fire elemental and star elemental forces into his spear force, it was as though a dry land had suddenly been blessed with a flood of water. It greedily swallowed it all, its insatiable greed fueling its rise in power. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. That's it. A crack suddenly resonated in Lionel's mind, his irises flickering to life as a red gold rune formed within their midst. As though being infused with a raging new power, Lionel's spear force gained a tinge of crimson, forming into a drill under the strength of his star constructs and aiming for the back of the ruined Rapax once again. Bang! The result was far outside of expectations. Lionel found himself being slapped flying, his ribs breaking in several places, and a projectile of blood leaving his lips and marring the inside of his helmet. Lionel could only use the tendrils of darkness from his beast armor to break his impact against the wall. But even that hardly made it better. With a grunt, Lionel slid down an opposing wall, the menacing roar of a ruined Rapax bearing down on him. The ruined Rapax's mouth had split over, revealing a long row of sharp, saliva-dripping teeth and a tongue longer and more rugged than any Lionel had ever seen before. In the blink of an eye, it had already appeared above Lionel, its menacing mouth dripping. Lionel coughed again, his gaze looking up as he slumped to the ground. It seemed that in the end, he wasn't able to predict the next attack like he had the first. Lionel had maximized his chances by minimizing the amount of times the ruined Rapax could attack, but he couldn't seal the deal. However, even now Lionel's gaze was unmoved. "Haven't noticed something wrong with your body yet?" Lionel asked coldly. The ruined Rapax froze. Fallen Apostle ebook should be live in 4-ish hours, I think, or whenever the 24th is for you. If not, it will be sometime tomorrow. Big thanks to you guys for always supporting me. Linktree. /Osbeck, October 23, 22. Chapter 1340. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 53 seconds p.m. Chapter 1340. No use if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1340. No use. The concentration of anarchic force in the region had reached a point the ruined Rapax had never experienced before. In its rage, and also thanks to Lionel's moon construct dilating its senses, it hadn't noticed until it was far too late. And to make matters worse, albeit just to small wounds, the open gashes on its back seemed to become a prime spot for the most vicious force in the universe to assault. Lionel had thought a lot about the Rapax in recent days. Among what fascinated him the most, aside from their ability to escape detection of internal sight, was their odd use of force. This race of being didn't use force like humans did. Or rather, they might have only done so in part. They didn't pull on atmospheric force, and seemed to rely entirely on what their bodies could produce. It could be said that they were completely antithetical to much of the battle style Lionel had forged in recent years. Because of his apprehension toward his Scarlet Star Force innate node, Lionel rarely if ever used his internal force, relying entirely on outside measures. However, what was truly interesting was that after beginning to use his nodal pathways and force nodes as he should, Lionel was still very much certain that his efforts were different from the Rapax. It was something deeper than just using internal force, something more profound. Even when Lionel used his internal force, it didn't seem as fused and one with him as what the Rapax could accomplish. It was clear that the Rapax were fusing with their force on a much deeper level, a level Lionel couldn't fathom. And that was when it clicked. How was it that Lionel's metal synergy lineage factor worked? Well, his bronze runes became the conduit by which he could absorb the essence of ores and foundationally change his body. It etched onto his bones, his inner organs, and even his blood vessels. When thinking to this point, was it truly a coincidence that the most powerful of the Rapax were known as ruined Rapax? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. The mechanism was likely not the same, obviously, but Lionel felt that it was highly likely to be similar. And just like Lionel had runes within his body that others could see with the naked eye, so too would the Rapax. With that thought in mind, Lionel realized that this should have been the source of the Rapax strength. They absorbed force during their practice and infused it into the runes. Upon doing so, they could assimilate with this force, fuse with it, and make it their own, thereby strengthening their bodies manifold over. So, why was this so important now? It was because all the precious source of force that the ruined Rapax pulled upon was within its body, and it was precisely these sort of dense regions of force that anarchic force liked to latch onto and swallow the most. Lionel believed that if he could just make the Rapax suffer a wound, a deep enough gash that its blood flowed and the anarchic force could get a taste of, the creature would suddenly find itself in a predicament that it would be hard-pressed to crawl out of. Scree! Lionel slowly stood from the ground, a hand across his chest and ribs as the Rapax struggled and screeched. The size difference between the two was enormous, and the strength gap was even more exaggerated. And yet, it was Lionel who stood, a cold expression on his face and his aura bearing down as though this was just the obvious outcome. "There's no use in screaming," Lionel said lightly. "I've learned in recent times that the higher up in dimensions you go, the more reliant you are on the push and pull forces of force itself. It's quite fascinating, really. Even a shout won't travel as far in a higher dimensional world as it would in a lower one, let alone when the anarchic force is so great. Why do you think I dared to battle you instead of just running?" Lionel had no idea if the ruined Rapax could understand him, but he didn't seem to care, his cold eyes calculating everything as the Rapax soon found it difficult to even stand. The anarchic force concentration had been multiplied to the point there was practically no other force to pull upon in this region. Maybe the only two existences that could survive beneath such a concentration was a little beast with void beast blood, and a man who had spent the last several months torturing himself on an even greater quantity. This chapter upload first at novelbin.net. When Lionel seemed to have seen all he needed to see, he turned his head toward Little Black Star. Yip! The little mink dove down. Unable to even resist at this point, the ruined Rapax could only put up a futile attempt at resistance before Black Star exited out the back of its skull, having entered through its mouth. Before the ruined Rapax could die, though, Lionel sent it into a snow globe. He had no way of knowing if the Rapax sent out signals after their death, or if there was a method of keeping track of them. Though he was quite confident in the concentration of anarchic force stopping pretty much everything, given the fact the Rapax had become used to this environment over such a long period of time, there was no way of telling whether they had more sophisticated methods of dealing with this, and Lionel didn't feel like finding out. Coughing heavily, Lionel looked down at his chest. That one kick had almost broken all of his ribs. In fact, he was lucky that each had only broken in one spot. If not for his sturdy body, the result would have likely been countless little shards of bones piercing through his lungs and heart. My healing factor is so slow in this world. Lionel debated whether or not he should use his. But after a moment he decided against it. He could still hang on. Picking a direction, he sprinted out of the dense concentration of anarchic force. Then, taking a deep breath and bracing for the worst, he brought Aina out once again. Bang. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1341. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 51 seconds p.m. Chapter 1341. Bang. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1341. Bang. Lionel coughed up another large mouthful of blood. Son of a bitch. He had gotten far too used to seeing this ceiling today. But he hadn't expected to see it after saving a beauty. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. Who wrote this bullshit? Unfortunately, it wasn't over. Lionel had hoped that a single strike would be enough to vent her rage, but he had hardly rebounded off of an opposing wall when he found another fist nearing his face. Lionel reacted as quickly as he could, crossing his arms over his head. But to his astonishment, it had been nothing more than a feint. What looked like a dainty hand, completely dwarfed by the size of Lionel's own, smashed a fist into his chest, sending Lionel into the wall again. The pain wrecked Lionel's body, his partially healed ribs cracking cleanly once again with an audible snap. With how powerful Lionel's body was, every injury he suffered was like metal being snapped in two. Even his muscles themselves were like intertwining steel cords, layered atop of one another with a strength that spoke for itself. The second wave of pain seemed to snap Lionel awake, the helplessness in his gaze vanishing, and leaving behind a hidden sharpness. Lionel immediately entered a defensive position, tucking his elbows to the side of his body and raising his fists to opposing sides of his face. Like this, he could finally see the rampaging Aina before him. If it wasn't for the ridiculous situation he was in, he might have spared a thought for how much of a war goddess she seemed to be right this moment. This chapter upload first at novelbin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Her tight beast skin clothing clung to her curves, her muscles pulsing with a vibrant power. She released a barrage of kicks and fists, entering a furious berserk state, as though she wanted nothing more than to see Lionel beaten into mincemeat. Lionel couldn't seem to find a gap to counterattack. Aina's assault was seamless, and even though she rarely used her fists and legs like this, her battle sense didn't seem to take even the slightest hint. In fact, after just a handful of exchange, a glow took hold of Aina's body and Lionel's brow furrowed. Fist force. Suddenly, Aina's attacks became sharper. Lionel realized he couldn't stay on his back foot like this, or else all he would be was a glorified punching bag. Even his metallic body was starting to feel as though it was being kneaded into a soft dough beneath this woman's relentless barrage. He took a strong step forward, taking advantage of his powerful defenses, and swinging a punch-out that ignored everything. He just needed to break Aina's rhythm, just enough that he could find a chance to counter. However, he had only just opened up his defenses when Aina's figure seemed to flicker, her fist connecting with his chin as though there was a magnet connecting the two. Lionel felt his head spin, his hook losing momentum. Without dream sense, he couldn't shake his mind awake fast enough, and he quickly suffered a shin to his hip mere instants later. Damn it! Aina's violent barrage seemed to leave craters in Lionel's body. He bounced around like a pinball. Every time it seemed like he would escape, he'd find another fist or foot in his path, throwing him back from whence he came. That's enough. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net Lionel's roar was like a clap of thunder, however it didn't waver Aina's assault in the slightest. It rolled off her shoulders as though it was never there, but by then, Lionel's gaze had already become a frightening cold. The Aina reflected in his gaze became nothing more than a slab of meat, a simulation hovering within his dream world. Going from the difficulty in calculating a Rapax, next move to the ease of calculating a human's seemed to fuel Lionel, with a sharper mind. It was like he had just spent years in a low-oxygen environment, only to suddenly have all the air he could breathe at once. His body thrummed like it had been hit with a spike of dopamine, his movements suddenly becoming so sharp and calculated that Aina was forced to take her first step backward. Fists and knees clashed as though cinder blocks. It didn't sound like the resonating echoes of flesh and bone. Rather, the two were like machines of war, commanding their mechs to leave devastation in their wakes. What Lionel lacked in battle prowess, his mind made up for in spades. What Aina lacked in calculative ability, her innate senses and reflexes covered for several times over. The two were like a whirlwind, twin cyclones rampaging about, and only seeming to grow more and more violent with each passing moment. Their eyes locked across the short distance that separated them, their irises flickering with an undisguised coldness. Bang, bang, bang. Elbows, knees, feet, even a headbutt or two when they seemed to have completely run out of methods to attack. They were absolutely relentless, seemingly holding nothing back. Little Blackstar hopped in the air from side to side, completely agitated. It was like the poor little guy was watching his parents fight, and didn't even know how to go about stopping it. The little mink could only let out exasperated yips from time to time, making it seem like he was trying to get to them to stop, but to no avail at all. It was as though the two had completely forgotten that they were in enemy territory. In fact, with the way things looked now, maybe it was lucky the Rapax didn't come across them in such a state, or else the first to be ripped apart would definitely be them. Bang! Their fists collided through the air, both being forced to skid back. Their arms hung in the air, their eyes still glaring at one another. Hot air billowed out of both of their mouths, their lungs and limbs screaming. However, they didn't speak a single word. Chapter 1342. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 49 seconds p.m. Chapter 1342. Familiar words. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1342. Familiar words. Little Blackstar was caught between relief and panic. Even though the constant barrage had finally come to a stop, the little guy was emotionally intelligent enough to know that things wouldn't just end with that. Maybe the two had only stopped at this point because past this was most definitely a state of no return. Their stamina already seemed to have taken a large hit. If they went any further, they really wouldn't be able to deal with any danger that came. I should have done this years ago. Aina spoke coldly. You must think I'm really afraid of you. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, and clearly it's because I've been too easy on you. Lionel's lip twitched. This woman seemed to have entered a demonic mode. I promise you this. Every time you do this to me, I will beat you until you're completely unrecognizable. Last time I just ran away and apparently that made you think me to be soft. It won't happen again. Lionel suddenly got the impulse to touch his face, only to realize that his raised arm looked as though he had stuffed several balloons beneath his skin. His expression flickered, and by the time he actually touched his face, He realized that it was completely swollen as well. It was then that Aina's words about beating him until he was unrecognizable seemed to ring in his ears again. She wasn't just saying that, she had been serious. Her control of her strength was so great that her every punch, kick, knee and elbow managed to generate the greatest damage to his flesh, resulting in these exaggerated bruises all across his body. Lionel had been so certain that his aches and pains were from his battle with the ruined Rapax that he didn't even notice that he was being turned into a charity case. Lionel was speechless. This chapter upload first at NovelBin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed every time you do this to me. I will beat you until you're completely unrecognizable. He could see by the fire lit in her eyes that she really meant it. It didn't matter if they were in the middle of a Rapax nest, if they were deep within enemy territory, maybe even if they were in the middle of fighting a war, she would truly drop everything to beat him up. What kind of nonsense was this? The worst part was that even though it felt like a joke, Lionel could feel how livid Aina was. The fact she had only gone so far was actually an outward showing of restraint for her. If she really unleashed everything, it wouldn't be her fists cutting into his body, but rather a bloody axe. Aina was right. Last time he did this to her, she had just left everything and disappeared. This time, however, it seemed she had taken a different approach. But this sort of approach wasn't something that Lionel cared for at all. Especially not when he had just cracked his ribcage open to ensure they could both get to safety. Rather than being thankful for that or showing any appreciation, he was actually greeted with more pain. Fine. He had already been prepared for the backlash his actions would come with. But, wasn't this too far? If she wasn't, Lionel's brow furrowed when his thoughts reached this point. He never usually cared if an enemy was female or not. Had anyone else done this to him, he would have definitely did far more in revenge. He didn't like this weight hanging around his every action when it came to this woman. It was like he couldn't be his true self. Lionel lowered his fist, his expression only becoming colder. And yet, Aina stood right across from him, her expression not softening in the slightest at all. Her demeanor seemed to scream that no matter what Lionel said, she would meet him from lower ground. Even if that lower ground required a fist. If you can't understand why I do things the way I do, what's the point? My mom said something very important to me a few months ago. When someone shows you who they are, believe them. Trying to change a person will never work. You're doing nothing but wasting your time. Every time this situation happens, I will take the same course of action. No amount of tantrums you throw will change that. And if there ever comes a day where this tantrum of yours really compromises our ability to survive, while you've made a promise yourself, I can promise that in such a situation, I'll disregard any mental blocks I have toward harming you entirely. Trust me, if there's one thing I'm good at, it's getting rid of mental blocks. I hope you'll show some propriety and not allow things to get that far. This chapter upload first at NovelBin.net. Aina stared at Lionel deeply, her own oppressive aura still rising. Even the earth seemed to rumble beneath her. I can promise you if that day really does come, I won't hold back either. If you think you're the only one holding back, you have another thing coming. My axe won't show mercy. Lionel's brows furrowed, his frown deepening. After a moment, though, his expression completely relaxed, a detached sort of appearance being all that was left. If that's how things are, then it's better for us to go our separate ways. I can't have a liability who can't understand how I see things by my side. You'll be nothing more than a ticking time bomb. Aina sneered. Understand how you view things? What about how I view things? The only thing that matters is my final decision. If you can't trust me to make it, then you might as well go call someone else king. Lionel's voice boomed, a wild violet aura raging around him. The oppression of his mind's coercion seemed to stream forward like a raging tide, a tsunami that only seemed to grow taller with every passing moment. However, Aina's rage somehow still seemed more palpable. Her hair fluttered wildly, her canines seeming to grow a measure as her irises sparkled like drops of ambrosia. A king also knows when to listen. You keep talking about trust this and trust that, but all you really want are blind followers that will both do everything you ask them to do on a whim. and yet also allow you to take control of everything at the same time. You keep asking me to have trust in you, but where's your trust in me? What's the point of building a kingdom if all you want to do is fight on your own? Do I look like a fragile flower to you? You're a hypocrite. A fucking sociopathic hypocrite. Lionel froze. Chapter 1343. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 48 seconds p.m. Chapter 1343. Northern Magnet. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1343. Northern Magnet. A hollow sound rang in Lionel's ears, almost as though an enormous explosion had gone off in his surroundings, and now only an eerie sharpness of what remained of his hearing was left. Even with all the sensory perception and infallible memory in the world, in just those few seconds, it was as though his mind was blank. He couldn't see or hear anything, nor could he remember what kind of thoughts he was having. Lionel never hid anything from Aina. There were secrets he probably should have kept from everyone around him that would have probably made it easier to protect their safety, that he had still chosen to tell to her. And there were secrets that weren't so important, but were far more personal, that he had still decided to tell her as well. But there were two things Lionel had never told Aina. Whether consciously or subconsciously, he never even began to express them. It was hard to tell if he had done it on purpose, or if it was a sheer coincidence that he never got around to doing so. But one was hard-pressed to believe that two such important things just happened to be matters that Lionel didn't get around to telling someone he usually told everything about. The first was Lionel's true status as a dark prisoner. He never explained anything about his evaluation as a child, how this had estranged him from the Fox family when he might otherwise have grown up with a fine relationship with the royal family, or how Lionel had taken his place. The second, though, was related to the specifics of that night after Aina was forcefully teleported to Terrain. And how that night, the words Aina had just spoken were the exact words James had said to him that day. These were two memories that Lionel had long since buried deep within him, and with his control over his mind, he never thought about them. Unlike a normal individual who might stumble onto such thoughts from time to time, and suddenly find themselves flashing back to that day, Lionel was completely different. It could be said that since those events happened, this was maybe only the first or second time he had thought of them. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. In that moment, he couldn't seem to escape it. Without access to Tier 4 of his ability index, he couldn't control the facets and knobs of his mind as easily as he could before, resulting in a relentless flood that bombarded his thoughts and threatened to turn his brain to mush. He could suddenly remember everything about that day. The devastation of the artillery shells that had fallen around them, the screams of women and children who were caught in the crossfire, and even the light reflected in James' eyes when he said those words. His father's gun still held to his temple. Are you sure that you want me to kill him? Lionel could remember looking deeply at James, still very much wanting his deductions to be wrong. Maybe it was a coincidence that the man holding a gun to James' head was so tall. Maybe the resemblance they shared was overblown by him. Maybe he had overestimated the strength of James' great energy shield ability and underestimated the power of a bullet. Maybe, just maybe, his best friend of over a decade wasn't trying to drag him toward his death. Just maybe he was wrong for once. However, his mind was too sharp. He could see that change in James' expression immediately. He could feel his best friend's heart skip a beat even under the influence of all the noise. At that moment he knew that the friend he had come to know was gone. I'm disappointed. I really took you as my closest friend. Lionel had meant those words more than anything. James was his closest friend, his best friend, his brother. Their personalities were hardly anything alike, but they were inseparable. It was the kind of relationship that Lionel couldn't explain even if he tried. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If he was honest with himself, maybe James had just as much to do with his moral code than any of his father's teachings had. Being drilled again with the importance of respect and persistence was nice, but there were so many ways to interpret those two words. Who deserved respect? What kind of goals were worth being persistent in the face of? The answers to these questions was probably more important than the mantra themselves. If Lionel's father had been his compass, James had been the magnetic pole that wrenched him northward. This wasn't because James was so morally superior. In fact, James was an asshole, not much unlike how Lionel's father had been in his youth. He used women like rags, he didn't care enough to pay much attention in school, he put no effort into anything because his family was rich and famous, and he hadn't hesitated to attempt to betray the hopes of dreams of a team filled with his brothers for his own selfish goals. There was nothing about James that screamed moral direction. But that was ironically the very reason why he was so profoundly important to Lionel. Despite his flaws, despite how seemingly worthless he was, despite how by every observable metric that decided human value according to society labeling him a net negative, Lionel had always loved him. James had always been his brother. The first person he told about Aina, the only person who knew how much he hated playing quarterback, the only person who knew what was hidden behind his perpetual charismatic smile. To most others, James was worthless scum. And yet to Lionel, he was invaluable in a way that was just impossible to explain. And if even someone like James could hold such supreme value to him, then who was he to cast judgment upon the worth of anyone else? But bullshit! James suddenly roared. You pretend to care about so many things, you pretend to be kind-hearted, but all you really care about are things ending up exactly like you want them. You don't like killing only because you don't want to deal with the guilt. You don't like playing football only because you didn't get to choose it. You only want to do things your way and nothing else matters. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1344. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 46 seconds p.m. Chapter 1344. A betrayal long ago. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1344. A betrayal long ago. Remembering back now, Lionel could understand why James had reacted that way. When he spoke his truth, saying that James was his closest friend, remembering the details of how it had happened now hit him like a ton of bricks. His voice had been so cold, so detached, so emotionless. It was as though he had said it all perfunctorily, as though he was shaking his head toward a child that had disappointed him rather than been heartbroken at the betrayal of a friend. By that point, he had already disassociated, ripping that part of himself out and ignoring it like he always had. Even when he knew that James had betrayed them during the biggest game of the year, Lionel hadn't said a word, just silently finding a method to win anyway, just like he always did. He didn't approach James, he didn't ask him what was wrong, he just did things as he pleased, finding a solution that could please everyone. James got to appease whoever had commanded him to lose by making it obvious he had done his best, and Lionel got what he wanted. Another victory. When the two met in the locker room, Lionel could remember how livid James had been. You knew you get the unnecessary roughness call, right? I know you too well. You don't like to lose, but you're too soft-hearted to call me out on my bullshit too. So you'd find a way to protect our friendship and ignore it, all while winning the big game anyway. Am I right? This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. If you knew I needed your help, why couldn't you lose this one time? This is just a game, isn't it? You've already won it 3 times, did you really need to win a 4th? You don't even want to be a quarterback. The words still rung in Lionel's head, even down to James eventually apologizing. At least then Lionel had still been able to lace his words with some sort of emotion, some sort of understanding and sympathy. But afterward, he seemed to have completely lost that ability. While he stood there months later, Aina gone from his side, his body beaten and tired, an entire fortress of enemies eagerly waiting to take his head, Lionel hadn't truly felt the weight of the events. He had been confused by James' words. He even remembered thinking them to be a jumbled mess of nonsense. He had even somewhat arrogantly thought that this was just another case of James not being quite eloquent enough to say what he needed to say. Another example of his imperfect best friend displaying his lack of value to the world. But could Lionel still love him now? Even after such a betrayal? Was that even possible? You're a fucking sociopathic hypocrite. The world seemed to go white for Lionel. Lionel remembered that he said many more words after that. Words that had even left James as white as a sheet and as silent as a mouse. But in his ears now, those words seemed to ring hollow. Leaving James speechless wasn't a feat. Hadn't he arrogantly proclaimed that his so-called best friend wasn't very good with words to begin with? It was ironic. He loved James like a brother, and James could be said to be the very reason he didn't become the sort of person who could treat human lives like weeds. And yet, in order to come to that conclusion to begin with, hadn't he needed to assign some value to James? Didn't he need to mark him down as someone worthy or unworthy? Make a list of his deficiencies before deciding whether or not he was still worth loving or not. Whether he was still worthy of being his friend. This chapter upload first at novelbin.net. When you thought about what that truly meant, it was sick. As though Lionel thought of James like a little pet project of his. A poor little boy who no one else wanted. But that was okay, because Lionel would take him under his wings anyway. Maybe James, in all his simplicity, could actually feel Lionel's true intent. While everyone else only saw Lionel for what he showed to the world, James saw Lionel for what he was. In all his flaws, some far more tragic than others. It couldn't be said that James was a good person. It was the direct opposite, in fact. He had put his own selfish desires above even the safety of Lionel's life. Maybe he had told himself that he would be able to use his influence over his father to ensure that Lionel would live even after being caught. But that would have been nothing more than a coping mechanism for his own cowardice in being unable to stand up to his own father. However, this had only made it easier for Lionel to ignore his own flaws. James was the only person who knew him so intimately. The only person who understood how his brain worked and how he saw the world. Even if James couldn't put it into words, how would he have felt knowing that he was just another calculation to Lionel? An odd quirk in an otherwise logical world that Lionel was so fascinated by that he just had to keep him by his side? Maybe James wouldn't have been able to express exactly that in words, but he would have felt it. That sort of lingering inferiority. The kind that cast the mind into a perpetual, endless darkness. The very same kind of darkness he couldn't escape from in his own family and father. It probably would have felt to James that the friend he thought would always have his back had betrayed him long ago. That what they had built their friendship upon was nothing but a bed of lies that Lionel had concocted. Everything seemed to hit Lionel all at once. Like a rushing tsunami, it crashed into him, burying him deep. He suddenly found that he couldn't breathe, his face turning blue and his body suddenly not functioning properly anymore. Everything wanted to shut down around him. Chapter 1345. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 45 seconds p.m. Chapter 1345. Semantics. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1345. Semantics. How long had it been since he had access to Tier 4 of his ability index? Lionel only had a very vague understanding of abilities when he began his journey. However, by the time he had been able to comprehend, he had already entered Tier 4. It could be said that from the very beginning, he had always been in such a state. What did that mean? It meant that since the very moment Lionel had awakened his ability, he had gained with it a perfect sort of control over his body that extended to his mind. This sounded like a great thing, but when he was completely ignorant to what he was doing, he was essentially digging himself into a larger and larger hole every time. Whenever Lionel believed that he was able to easily cut off his emotions because that was just the kind of person he was, naively believing that this would have no impact on him since he could so naturally do it, the reality of it all was that this was just an example of his ability at work. It had to be understood that Lionel wasn't like the people of Earth. He had been born with his ability index, and he didn't have to wait for the metamorphosis. The only reason it didn't manifest in full force until after the metamorphosis was because of actions his father had taken. Now, however, Lionel's ability index had suddenly been suppressed back down to Tier 3 for the first time, and Lionel had no method of dealing with it. Aina, though, had no idea what she had just triggered within Lionel, though it felt like a long time, and that going through such a long list of memories had taken forever. The reality was that even after dropping down to Tier 3, his thinking speed was well beyond the imagination of most. It was to the point where Aina was still in the middle of speaking even after his body seemed to have hit a wall. I don't know why it's so difficult for you to understand. I know I was wrong in the past to make you want to stay away from danger, but can't we at least compromise? Is it so impossible to meet in the middle for you? Why can't we just fight together? That's not even the point. I wouldn't even mind if you had a plan that I couldn't be a part of, a plan that you know I'd be detrimental to. But would it be impossible for you to communicate that? Why are you so stubborn? Do you really see everything you go off and do on your own as heroic and protective? I don't see it that way at all. It's demeaning. It's like you can't be bothered to trust no one other than yourself, because no one could possibly touch your lofty existence. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novelnext. Com to experience faster update speed. Aina's chest heaved, her gaze a furious shade of gold. But it was right then that Lionel's figure stumbled, his hand involuntarily reaching for his chest and his face becoming a ghastly shade of blue. In order to maximize his efficiency, after learning the full extent of what being in Tier 4 meant, Lionel began to push himself past normal limits. Normally, even something most allowed their bodies to regulate, like the cadence of their heart or the flow of their digestion, was entirely controlled by Lionel. This allowed him to put his energy toward the best things imaginable. After his ability index fell down to Tier 3, these functions obviously shut off and were handed back to Lionel's body to regulate. The change was seamless as everyone's body was designed to handle this matter regardless. However, Aina's words seemed to have shocked Lionel, and his mind was now in a state of fighting against itself. He wanted to wrest the control he had lost back to make these feelings go away, but the trouble was that he was no longer in Tier 4. If a normal person wanted to accomplish the impossible, they would just be finished. They would try to tap into abilities they didn't have and they would fail. End of story. But the trouble was that Lionel had a lineage factor that quite literally gave his will strength. King's might. Now Lionel's mind was in a furious state, wanting his ability to evolve and transcend its limits, but the anarchic force in the surroundings was simply too potent to allow such a thing. This sort of tug-of-war caused Lionel's body to completely shut down. His blood stopped flowing, his heart stopped beating. Even his brain itself seemed to want to close up shop. Lionel? Lionel. Aina's expression warped wildly as she dove forward, catching Lionel's head just before it smashed against an opposing stone wall. But she was immediately shaken when she felt just how cold his skin was. If there was one thing that Lionel was perpetually, it was hot. His fire affinity was so high that this was undeniably the case. There was simply no escaping it. Lionel's body went rigid before everything suddenly loosened. His skin and face went completely blue, his lips following soon, even as the whites of his eyes bulged with red blood vessels behind their lids. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Lionel. To Aina's horror, Lionel's heart actually wasn't beating at all. She immediately used everything she had learned as a 5-star medical professional of Earth, laying him down and beginning CPR, but it felt that no matter what she did, it wouldn't matter. Aina's face was filled with panic. She could have never drawn the conclusion that her words had caused this, so she immediately thought that it was because she had fought Lionel. The ruined Rapax must have left behind more severe wounds than she thought, and her subsequent fight with Lionel must have triggered them. The guilt was enough to overshadow her world entirely, tears beginning to stream down her face completely outside of her control. Yip. Yip. An anxious little black star dove down from the air, pulling at Lionel's hair in hopes of waking him up before furiously licking at his cheek. Right then, something within Lionel snapped, his body convulsing. Lionel's eyes suddenly shot open, a blinding light beaming out from them as a force art more complex than words could describe began to revolve within them. In an unknown corner of the dimensional verse, a handsome middle-aged man yawned, shifting his glasses upward as he scratched his ass. At that moment he looked upward, his mouth still open in mid-yawn form before he shook his head. Aya, that brat of mine is always ruining my plans. What is that, twice now? Why can't you just follow the normal schedule I so painstakingly drew out? You're going to make this old man seem incompetent. Whatever. I have an excuse to see my beautiful wife again so soon. Hopefully she doesn't make a fuss about it being an avatar again. I'm trying to save the world here. It can't be that such small semantics is going to make a hero like me go without sex, right? Velasco tossed an odd ball of force casually, and yet it shot off into the distance, disappearing over the horizon near instantly. Chapter 1346. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 44 seconds p.m. Chapter 1346. Worse than changing diapers if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1346. Worse than changing diapers. Lionel. Aina had done everything she could, even pressing down so forcefully that the ribs Lionel hadn't broken yet snapped cleanly. But she was well aware that when a medical professional had to choose between a few broken ribs and restarting a heart, there was almost no decision to be made. Bones could heal, but a dead heart would never come back. The sudden flash of Lionel's eyes gave Aina hope, but the sudden and dense cloud of auspicious air that began to grow in the surroundings almost made her suffocate. This was the first time she was experiencing auspicious air personally, but she somewhat knew what it was. The trouble was that she didn't understand why it was suddenly coming out of Lionel's body in droves like this. At that moment, a certain beam of light ripped through the cosmos, appearing on the outskirts of the void battlefield and diving through its barriers. In a blink, it had appeared above a familiar hive, and in another, it had already flashed into the segmented cube without even Aina's knowledge. The ball of force appeared in Lionel's room, a region he had begun to use to keep things meticulously organized. It could be said that his room had become his functional spatial ring. As usual, it was spotless and clean, not that Lionel used it very often to begin with. Tucked into a corner, a familiar silver disc sat. Without much hesitation, the force buzzed and entered the dictionary, causing the mechanisms within to snap into a different configuration, its gears dancing and complex runes beginning to form along its surface. In the next moment, the disc began to hover, leaving the shelf and was tucked upon as a looming shadow began to envelop it. In the blink of an eye, that shadow took form, becoming the outline and eventual real body of a man Lionel was all too familiar with. Velasco held the dictionary in his hands, flipping it in the air and letting it land onto his palms as he strolled out of the room. A Rapak's nest? It seems someone is getting greedy. This chapter upload first at Novelbin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novelnext. To experience faster update speed. The moment Val stepped outside of Lionel's room, he raised an eyebrow, looking off in a certain direction. But in the end he completely ignored it. With a step, he vanished, appearing in the dense black fog of anarchic force alongside Aina and his brat of a son. Truthfully, it almost instantly became an awkward situation for Val. Aina was a mess, her tears coming out in a torrent. She alternated between using what felt like almost way too much force compressing Lionel's chest and kissing him with her. Well, very snotty face. Val couldn't help but feel like he had walked into a melodramatic scene. But when he looked at Aina again, he clicked his tongue. Not bad, at least this useless brat of mine gained at least a small bit of my skill. Despite the fact anarchic force was an excellent sound insulator, Val was simply too close in his presence even as an avatar. Well, it could be said that he had certain piercing qualities that made this concentration of anarchic force not too big of a deal. Who? Aina spun around, her axe leading her turn. Despite the state she had been in, she hadn't forgotten the kind of dangerous region they were in. From the very beginning, her senses had been primed. Oh my, is this how you greet your in-laws? Well, I can't say you're very different from my wife. Val flicked a finger upward just before Aina's axe could bury itself into his shoulder. Ing. The axe arched through the air and over his head, swinging in a long semicircle before just barely gliding over Lionel's nose and crashing into the ground. Aina's face turned completely pale for two reasons. The first was because she had no method of fighting back at all. And the second was because she had almost taken Lionel's head off, just an extra centimeter downward, and he would have been left with only a part of his nose. The worst part was that after being placed on its trajectory, Aina seemed to have completely lost the ability to alter its path. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net she ended up spinning completely around, her axe just barely slicing into the ground enough to stop. But the issue was that she knew that she didn't have nearly enough strength to cut into this stone. The strength difference was so enormous that she couldn't even fathom it. Even with her ability, she couldn't begin to make a plan on how she would get so strong. The peak was simply too tall. Aina was so dazed and worried that she didn't even register the words Val had spoken until several moments later. By the time she had thought of all sorts of methods she could use to run away with Lionel. When it clicked, though, she froze. What? Aina, whose hands had already found their grips latched onto Lionel's clothing, ready to leave her axe behind to rip him away, suddenly couldn't move. Val had already appeared on the other side of Lionel. He ignored Aina, shaking his head. Though he seemed unperturbed, this really was already the second time one of his plans didn't go as expected. Well, maybe it was to be expected considering what his actual goal was. Maybe even for him, everything going too smoothly was too much to expect. Troublesome kid. This is worse than changing diapers. Val pressed a finger to Lionel's forehead. Almost the instant he did, half of the density of auspicious air vanished. Sealing it too much will probably have a contrary effect. I guess I should let it free itself a bit. The momentum of Val's press lessened somewhat, but the auspicious air continued to recede. It's not time yet, brat. Try to do things on a schedule for once. The complex force arts rotating within Lionel's eyes slowed, many portions of them vanishing until a far less complex force art remained. However, even that eventually vanished, its presence remaining barely a lingering thought. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1347. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 43 seconds p.m. Chapter 1347. At best, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1347. At best, slowly, the odd aura around Lionel seemed to recede. Eventually, even the natural color of his skin returned. It was obvious at a glance that this wasn't because his issues had been resolved, but rather because for some odd reason, his ability index had returned to tier 4, allowing him control over his body again. Val stood up and stretched. With a flick of his finger, he sent the dictionary back into the segmented cube and yawned. Welp, I'm going to go and see my wife now. Bye. Val began to stroll away without a care in the world. But such casual actions left Aina baffled. That was it. He was just going to leave just like that? W8. HM. Val turned back, looking down curiously. Lionel. What's wrong with him? Val blinked, looking toward his son. His mind is imbalanced. It's not entirely his fault, it could be said to be mostly mine. But due to certain reasons, things need to stay this way for now or else the consequences will be even worse. Aina's expression sank. Then, nothing's changed? From what Val said, it sounded like it was Aina's words and not her actions that had caused this. This didn't change the guilt she felt much at all. If it wasn't for Val's appearance, Lionel would have very likely died here, and she was having a hard time reconciling with that fact. But if nothing had changed and Lionel had only gone back to his baseline, that made things even worse. That meant that he had suffered like that for nothing. Even though Val's previous words seemed to imply that he would grow stronger, that wasn't something Aina cared about. She was more worried about Lionel's mind and his psyche from here on. What would she do? This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. Val hummed. That would depend. Anyway, try not to die. Val tried to leave again, but he was once again stopped by words Aina spoke. Given his usual temperament, he would have likely dashed away and pretended not to hear anything. But given Aina's unique status, he guessed that he should probably be a bit more patient. He had heard his son talk about this girl for years, and this was the first time he was meeting her. Why? If you're so powerful, why put him through this? Val scratched his chin, pursing his lips a bit. Truthfully, he wasn't very much of a fan of explaining himself. He was usually right anyway. What was the point in getting the opinions of other people? Well, there was one woman who always forced him to explain himself anyway. Would he really get a daughter-in-law like that too? How much had he sinned in a previous life to deserve this? The world isn't as simple as you think it is, little girl. My real body isn't so free to do as it pleases. Though, I wasted 17 years raising this brat who keeps giving me more trouble every other day it seems. You know, that's not how the script is supposed to go. I was supposed to be the father that vanished after his birth, but a certain annoying family actually deemed to. Forget it. There's no point in talking about all this. All you need to know is that these matters aren't so simple. And if I don't do certain things, you two wouldn't get the chance to be two snotty-nosed brats making out in a rapak's nest. Aina's face turned a furious shade of red. Making out? She had been clearly performing CPR. How had it been twisted under the words of this man like this? Thinking back to all the things Lionel had told her about his father, Aina realized that he hadn't exaggerated at all. This man really didn't act his age, and apparently he also didn't act in line with the power he had. Still, seeing that he was being so vague and not answering much of anything, Aina also understood that there wasn't much of a point in pressing. If Val had wanted to explain, he would have. Seeing Aina lower her head and fall into silence, Val sighed. He had grown soft it seemed, feeling bad about such meaningless things. This was what happened when you had a wife and kids, your edge vanished. Eventually, this would come back to bite him. All right. Val waved his hand and a strong suction force formed. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net the segmented cube, still in its finger wrap form, flew into his hands. I know you're awake. Stop throwing a temper tantrum. Leave me alone. You son and father pair are just the same. Me? The same as this brat. Can't you see how much more handsome and suave I am? If he gained 10% of my skill it would be his blessing. Aina's lip twitched. Bah. Leave me alone. I need to rest. Yes. You can rest, just give me a rundown of what's been happening. Skip anything too unseemly. I don't want images of my son's poor performance in bed running through my mind. I have enough bullshit to deal with. Aina suddenly wanted to find a hole to bury herself in. Couldn't this man be more subtle? Where was the sense of propriety? Her face became like a shimmering lantern of red. She fixed her gaze to the floor, biting her lip. Val's gaze went blank for a moment as a subtle pulse of energy wafted out from the segmented cube. But, just as quickly he snapped back to reality. I see. Alright, easy fix then. Anastasia, siphon away some of my strength. Make a barrier of about level 2 strength around lab 1. Fine. Val flicked a finger and the segmented cube zipped back onto Lionel's finger. Finally he looked at Aina. You want to fix him, right? Simple. When he wakes up, tell him that he can forget about his little king role-playing game, until he can break that barrier. Oh, and tell him that I have enough power in a single cell to shatter that barrier 10 times over. Val waved a hand and strode away, his laughter causing the rapak's nest to quake. A king. What a joke. Your old man's still alive. At best, you can be a little prince. Chapter 1348. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 41 seconds p.m. Chapter 1348. Just like. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1348. Just like. Lionel shot up, his forehead almost banging against Aina's. But in a final moment he managed to come to a grinding halt, suddenly finding that the control he had over his body had reached a truly exaggerated degree. For a moment, their noses were barely a millimeter apart, their gazes locking. Even with the terrible scent hanging in the air, Lionel almost became too keenly aware of Aina's own delicate fragrance by contrast. He had no idea how she managed to not latch onto the stink the rest of this place had. But maybe he should never challenge a woman's ability to remain clean. Lionel's expression flickered, his mind suddenly running through everything it had been through in just the last several minutes. His brows furrowed. He had more control over himself now, but he didn't quite know how he should be reacting. His instinct was just to shut it all down again. Seeing Lionel's expression growing colder, Aina suddenly spoke. "Your father said." Aina repeated everything Val had said verbatim, not holding back. She thought about taking the edge off of the words, but in the end, she decided against it. She thought that with the relationship Lionel had with his father, maybe the rawest form of what he had said was exactly what Lionel needed to hear. Lionel was astonished, not knowing what to say for a long time. "My dad was here?" Lionel blinked as Aina nodded. He sent his mind into the segmented cube, and he did indeed find that Lab 1 was surrounded from all sides by a barrier. Even without trying, he knew that he didn't have a single chance at even cracking it, a calculation that he was surprised his mind could even accomplish, let alone complete so quickly. Lionel seemed to get the message loud and clear. This was how large the gap between him and the peak of the dimensional verse was. No, this couldn't even be considered the peak of the verse at all. At best, it could be considered the pinnacle of the middle tiers. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novelnext. To experience faster update speed. In truth, Lionel didn't need to hear this at all. Just the information that his dad had been here was enough to paint the picture. To be able to so casually enter a Rapax nest then leave as he pleased without a word, well, it all spoke for itself. Lionel suddenly smiled, his gaze lighting up. Aina was completely caught off guard by this. She couldn't truly understand. The words Lionel's father had spoken might seem benign from a certain perspective, but from another, they were the kind of words Lionel would hate to hear the most. She had come to learn of what her mistakes were in the past. She didn't give Lionel the support he needed even though he had always been there for her. This was why she had resolved that no matter what happened between now and the future, she would always be here. Her fighting it out with Lionel didn't mean she had already given up on this. It was just her way of showing that she had no intention of giving up on him. Maybe it wasn't the perfect method, but they were ultimately still young and she had spent most of her life without a normal range of emotion. It had been the only way she could think of to force Lionel to see her perspective. Ironically, though, it had ended up being her words that triggered all of this, but that only made it all the more baffling. Everything about Val's words had been a culmination of everything Lionel hated. His father's words had doubted him, belittled him, and even put him in his place without care or reserve for his face. So why was it that Lionel was grinning and laughing? Aina hadn't been nearly as harsh when she said similar things. She had only warned Lionel that the dimensional verse wasn't the kind of place that could be underestimated. She didn't want him to put his life on the line, just for the sake of saving people he didn't even know. She wanted him to stay by her side safe. It was then that it seemed to click for Aina. The love that Lionel had for his father made what he might feel for her feel small and meaningless. There was maybe no one in his life, and Lionel respected and adored more than his father. She had thought that because of how Lionel had practically worshipped the ground she walked on, that she could speak more freely than 99% of people in his life while in his presence. In a certain respect, she wasn't wrong. But it was always a matter of relativity. The things that Val could say to Lionel weren't the sort of things that she could get away with saying. At that moment, Aina came to understand. Lionel had put a lot of effort into winning her heart, years even. By this point, she would be lying if she said that she cared for anyone more than she cared for him. In fact, Lionel and her father held equal weight in her heart. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. Maybe that was because her relationship with her father wasn't nearly as good as the one Lionel shared with his own, but there was a certain level of love that blood ties could form that other forms of love otherwise couldn't. And yet, Lionel had managed to reach that level for her, while she had yet to reach that level for him. The truth was very simple. Despite his smile and charisma, Lionel was arrogant to his very bones. He had a relentless drive to win. He felt his opinion was more likely than not the right way to go, and he felt that questioning and doubting him were things most people simply didn't have the right to do. Even Aina herself. However, his father was very different. If there was one man that was his better, that had the right to question him, to doubt him, that might very well have an opinion that was superior to his own, it was Velasco Morales. A challenge from anyone else made Lionel turn his nose up. A challenge from his father, though, stoked the flames in his heart and made his gaze light up with ruthless ambition. Much like the day Lionel began to learn to craft, this time was not much different. Just a prince? Okay, for now we'll just be a prince until I can kick your ass, old man. Lionel's skin reddened, his veins pulsing with a dense reddish gold. A singular rune floated within each one of his irises, his blood rushing throughout his body. In that moment he became keenly aware of just how close Aina's nose was to his own. His fiery gaze met hers, his elevated heartbeat seeming to resonate between them. Aina's skin flushed red, looking away and pulling back slightly. Something about Lionel's eyes made her feel like a deer in headlights. But it was precisely because she did this that she didn't react in time to a pair of lips pressing onto her own. Somehow, it felt just like the first time. Chapter 1349. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 40 seconds p.m. Chapter 1349. Explain in words if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1349. Explain in words. An explosion went off in Aina's mind. Of all the things she thought would happen today, this was the very last. For a moment, she couldn't sense anything else but the sensation on her lips. Her heart fluttered, her blood ran hot, and her lower belly pulsed with an odd feeling she would have trouble putting into words. Her weight subconsciously fell onto Lionel, her palm pressing to his chest, and her lips weighing heavier on his as though to fuse with him. With how Lionel had sat up and how she kneeled on both legs, the shift in balance wasn't a lot, but it was usually more than enough to force someone else to waver. And yet, Lionel's body was like a sturdy wall, not shifting in the slightest even as Aina leaned into him. Little Blackstar, who had fallen into complete silence the moment Velasco had appeared, tilted his little head to the side. Even with all the emotional intelligence in the world, the little mink was ultimately still a child, and this situation was confusing nonetheless. They had gone from Lionel playing the part of valiant hero, to Aina unleashing a barrage of punches and kicks at his expense, to Lionel nearly dying, then to Aina meeting a man she was incredibly nervous around, then to Lionel being insulted maybe worse than he ever had in his entire life, all to end in a kiss? When Aina's foggy mind cleared and the reality of it all snapped into place, she pulled back quickly, her palm leaving Lionel's chest and becoming a fist that pressed into her own. She breathed heavily and erratically, her mind all over the place and her body flushed red. Aina didn't seem to want to look Lionel in the eye. There was something about this that felt wrong. She was one part happy, another part apprehensive, and a large part confused about how she should be feeling. It felt good. It felt really good. Even if she had never experienced it with someone else. Something in her intuition told her that Lionel was the only one who could possibly make her body feel like this with what amounted to a simple peck on the lip. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. He hadn't touched her body, he hadn't used his tongue, he hadn't even used any great pressure or coercion. In fact, it was she who had found herself leaning heavily into him as though wanting for more. And yet, she felt like she had flown to another world for a moment. Why did you do that? Aina asked softly. The happiness came too quickly. In one moment, she was made keenly aware that she lacked true stature in Lionel's heart, and in the next, he was making her feel as though she was riding on a cloud. She felt that in one part she should be angry, and she even somewhat felt used, but she still couldn't bring herself to feel that way. Because I really wanted to. Lionel said as though it was just a matter of fact. And maybe it was to him, but that didn't answer any of Aina's question. That's not an answer. Isn't it? Lionel smiled. Aina's heart began to beat wildly again. Lionel's words were definitely not always like this. At the very least, he couldn't always make her hang on to his every word like this. The Lionel she remembered was charming, but he also had a streak of boyish innocence and naivete to him. This Lionel felt more forceful and determined. Was this the change brought about by his goal? If Aina was honest, she hadn't spent enough time with Lionel post his decision to pick up on this change. It might have also been because she had spent most of that time trying to get him to change his mind about said goal. However, there was no denying that this Lionel held an even more lethal attraction to her. One that was far more difficult to ignore. It awoke a bit of her masochistic tendencies, something the previous Lionel had entirely failed to pick up on. But this Lionel would likely be far more in tune to. Aina was both frightened and excited by this prospect. But after a moment, she took a deep breath and calmed. After a second deep breath, she had returned to her baseline, her flushed skin receding and her gaze finally meeting Lionel's. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net explain it to me in real words. Aina said gently. Lionel blinked and thought for a moment. You're a distraction. I can't focus on the task at hand or make harsh and necessary decisions when you're around. In the time we weren't together, my progress was far faster than anything I've ever experienced. However, it's become more difficult to ignore you than I thought. My mind ends up wasting its potential power output by diverting some of its attention to suppressing and locking away emotions I would otherwise feel. But I've gotten way too ahead of myself. My dad is right. If he's alive, at best I can be a prince. There are certain burdens I shouldn't be taking on right now, burdens that would ultimately have the opposing effect to what I want. Instead of helping me in the future, it will instead slow my progress now. Since that's the case, there are certain things that aren't worth it. Treating you like a subordinate instead of my queen, for example, is one. It's objectively a foolish waste of time that would, theoretically, help me to stay focused and keep an eye on the future. But in the short term, it strains our relationship unnecessarily, while in the long term, no human has an infinite amount of patience. Even if you are determined to stay by my side now, it's impossible to tell if you'll still feel that way in 10 years, or 20 years, or more time than even that. And if I keep you by my side during all that time, while insisting to not cross certain barriers, it only makes the day you eventually snap and give up all the more devastating, because you would have been such an important and ingrained foundational pillar of all I had built until that point. Given that, just shut up and kiss me again. Aina's lips stifled what would have been the rest of Lionel's explanation. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1350. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 38 seconds p.m. Chapter 1350. Weird mind if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1350. Weird mind. Aina had realized something very important. The weight of Velasco's words to Lionel weighed more than anything else. If Aina had known what Velasco had said to Lionel months ago, she would have realized even more so how true those words were. Listen, kid, I always told you women were complicated. You spent 4 years chasing after that little girl. She probably thinks you'll always be there for her whenever it is she wants to come back. They were a sprawl of words randomly thrown into what was assuredly another prank, but Lionel seemed to have latched onto them. It made it far easier for him to draw a line in the sand, and maybe was part of the reason he had been so callous to Aina's words that day. It could be said that if there was anything Aina was certain of now, it was that Lionel wouldn't always be waiting for her. He hadn't come to stop her wedding, he hadn't been the catalyst who saved her, he hadn't even checked up on her afterward, and it all culminated in maybe the greatest heartbreak she had ever experienced in her lifetime. However, Aina was very determined about one thing. She didn't know how long it would take, she didn't know what she would have to do, but she would definitely one day be able to say words to Lionel that weighed just as heavily as his father's did. To her, this wasn't a matter of competition, but rather a reminder that she still had efforts to be made. The reality was that she didn't like Lionel bluntly breaking down their relationship into gains and losses, benefits and pitfalls. She hated it so much that while Lionel had been following her request to explain it in clear words, she had to fight back the will to punch him in the face again. This was the reason why she had stopped him despite him doing exactly what she had asked for. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit novelnext.com to experience faster update speed. However, she understood that this was truly how Lionel saw things even if she couldn't quite understand. Maybe his method of courting her in the past, his perpetual smile, his following her every step and action, had never really been him. That Lionel was always the version of himself he had thought she would want. It was the very same naive stage every young man went through, chasing after the woman of their dreams. They made the very false assumption that the best course of action to take was to simply comply with all of her wishes. She would definitely like you then. Unfortunately, this couldn't have been further from the truth. Of course, Lionel hadn't taken such action to an exaggerated degree. But he had most definitely let Aina mold many of his thoughts and tendencies. Even to the point it only took him a few days by her side to ignore how much he hated the way she viewed killing. As Lionel grew, though, his own thoughts and opinions solidified, and the way he viewed the world had subtly changed. He was still the same Lionel, but he was far more assertive. It was hard to say that he had truly matured, but he was definitely more of an adult. Aina thus understood that much of Lionel's infatuation had only been surface level, and she could only be said to have a place in his heart. But she didn't own it. Everyone had a small bit of selfishness in their heart. Aina simply wanted Lionel to love her as much as she loved him. Nothing more, nothing less. Yip. Yip. Little Black Star happily chirped, but also seemed to remind the two that they were still deep within enemy territory. Aina had already found herself straddling Lionel when Black Star's call made her blush. The little mink was right, they were technically in a very dangerous situation right now. She had been a small measure away from asking Lionel if he had a condom again. But, with her better judgment, she decided that she definitely didn't want to have her first time in this place. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net Lionel's head turned in a certain direction. It took several moments, so long, in fact, that Aina thought that he was mistaken. But after about half a minute her gaze too sharpened. "It's fine," Lionel said. "They're humans." As soon as Lionel said these words, a group of 3 rushed out of the dense black fog. They all looked to be in terrible shape, not a single one being without a devastating injury of some sort. In fact, it could be said that they would have already died if not for a certain event causing the Rapax they had been fighting to rush off. There didn't seem to be a decisive leader amongst the 3 while one was a woman, and the other 2 were men. Lionel couldn't recognize them, so it was likely that their foggy lake hadn't been the only one. But he had to think, just how big was the Rapax nest for them to send them all in here? With all the sectors there were, and there being at least 3 golden tokens to each, there had to be many that qualified for this trial. When they 3 spotted Lionel and Aina, though, their lips couldn't help but twitch. Lionel's back was reclined against a wall as he sat on the ground. Aina, though, had straddled his waist, placing both palms on his chest. Even though they both had serious expressions on now, there was no doubt about what they must have been doing before, especially since Aina's short beast skin skirt threatened to roll up her thigh and past her bottom. The 2 young men couldn't help but gulp, causing Lionel to raise an eyebrow. Seeing this, Aina almost couldn't help but giggle. Like the flip of a switch, Lionel had gone from not caring to if she got married to someone else to suddenly being prickled by looks that ultimately couldn't see anything anyway. She was suddenly fascinated by how Lionel's mind worked. Chapter 1351. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 36 seconds p.m. Chapter 1351. Be good. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1351. Be good. Lionel and Aina rose from the ground. Surprisingly, the both of them didn't seem to care much about the precarious situation they had been in. Aina simply picked up her enormous axe as though nothing had happened. Yip. Yip. Little Black Star dove into Aina's chest, causing her to smile. It seemed that little guy was even more excited than she was. But of course he was, he had finally gotten his favorite bed back. The 3 youths frowned. They were suddenly acutely aware that Lionel and Aina weren't injured in the slightest. Lionel's bruises and lumps had already healed along with his cracked ribs. Aside from a small bit of dried blood that touched his body here and there was nothing else. As for Aina, she was even less injured, having been stowed away for their only major fight. A bone she had yet to finish picking with Lionel. Lionel looked over the 3 youths. In truth, he had no intention of taking on burdens, and it would be more difficult to avoid detection if he took 3 people with him. But he also wouldn't feel right if he simply allowed 3 people he could have helped die. "We're close to the exit," Lionel said with a smile, and that was all he said. He had realized already that the method he and Aina had been taking was correct. They ruined Rapax hadn't been luring them incorrectly, but it was rather a problem of the fact Rapax would obviously be more familiar with their nest than Lionel could possibly be. So, when the ruined Rapax realized what they must want to do, cutting them off before they could reach their goal was child's play. Luckily, this meant that they were still near the entrance, or rather exit nonetheless. However, whether it was safe passage to take or not was a different matter entirely. Lionel turned and began to walk away with Aina by his side. The trio looked at one another, frowning. They weren't sure if Lionel's words were true. They had only come to this place because they were running away. They hadn't been paying attention to where they were going. This chapter upload first at NovelBin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. The lack of injuries on the pair, and their nonchalance seemed to scream that they were powerful. But was it really possible to leave this nest without so much as an injury? They were all absolute geniuses in their own right. They didn't believe that the gap between them and someone else could possibly be so wide. So, could it just be that they had gotten lucky and didn't come across any enemies? Forget it, it doesn't matter. We have no idea where we're going anyway, and would have to just randomly pick a direction. We might as well see if they're right about the exit. One of them spoke. Lionel didn't look back when he felt them being followed. He had already done his part. Whether they chose to follow him or not had nothing to do with him any longer at that point. As Lionel had expected, after splitting down just one more tunnel, the wind shifted and the air became slightly cleaner. After traveling several hundred more meters, Lionel came to the edge of a corner and came to a grinding halt. Aina stopped right behind him and little Blackstar grew quiet. Following their lead, the 3 also came to a pause. Lionel closed his eyes, his brows furrowing. There was nothing there. No guards, no sentries, nothing. He couldn't sense any force arts, no traps, and even the flow of force didn't have anything wrong with it. There wasn't even something as simple as a door. It was just opened wide to the expanse of what Lionel assumed was the void battlefield. No, there's something odd there. Lionel's brows shot up, and he suddenly understood. This path sloped upward, going from deep underground to above it, and forming the whole of an exit/entrance. However, on the opposite side, there was actually another entrance. It wasn't just that, there were entrances surrounding this one entirely. And beyond that, there were enormous domes riddled with holes that Lionel was fairly certain were likely the very same holes they had been looking up through earlier. There was definitely a 300-meter drop on the other side of them. This chapter upload first at NovelBin.net. Shit. Lionel's gaze narrowed. This wasn't just a Rapax nest. It was a field of Rapax nests. If they wanted to get out of here, they would need to somehow navigate through them all until they could find a nest on the edge to escape. Lionel was suddenly annoyed by his dad. The old man couldn't have said a single word about this. He could have at least pointed out a direction. But as things stood now, Lionel was truly uncertain of which way to go. Even though he had noticed that his senses had actually greatly improved, it still wasn't enough to cover an entire network of nests, especially when just one was so large already. On top of that, for the same reasons as before, traveling above ground definitely wasn't an option, at least not long term. It was fine if this exit didn't have guards because each nest essentially fed into one another. However, Lionel was still certain that there were many keeping an eye on the above-ground holes, or else the Rapax would be far too easy to infiltrate. We have to take a risk. We can't just blindly choose a direction and hope for the best. I need to fly high enough into the sky to see which way is the shortest to safety. So long as I can lock onto that direction, even while stuck beneath the ground, I'll be able to stay true to it. But I need the direction first. Lionel took a deep breath, his gaze steeling. Then he took a long stride forward. But just before he could do as he planned, he suddenly felt a strong force grab onto his wrist and yank him backward. Lionel looked back to find a glaring Aina. No, you don't. You're going to be a good boyfriend and tell me exactly what you're planning. Then we'll see if I should get involved or not. Lionel's lip twitched. The three youths to their backs looked toward one another, not sure of how to react. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1352. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 35 seconds p.m. Chapter 1352. Trust if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1352. Trust. Lionel sighed. All right. The exit is around the corner, but there's nothing guarding it. And? Anna asked. She was smart enough to know that this was definitely not a good thing. Different species aside, the Raypaks were clearly intelligent. They wouldn't make such a rudimentary mistake. There's nothing guarding it because they don't need to guard it, at least not this exit in particular. We're currently surrounded by 3 other identical entrances that lead to other hives identical to this one. In fact, we're in a field of nests right now and my internal sight doesn't spread far enough to tell if we're nearer the middle, an edge, or what direction we should go in. The expressions of the 3 youths sunk when they heard this. They had thought that they were close to at least leaping over this first hurdle, but there was actually so much more to go. Who had set up this selection? Did they want them all to die? So you want to fly up and check which direction to go. Aina finished. There's no real other choice. Of course there's another choice. You could make an image probe to check for you. If that doesn't work, there's Blackstar. His stealth is much higher than any of our own. He could probably do it without risking being found out at all. An image probe would require materials and a force art that wouldn't be eroded by anarchic force, neither of which I have on hands right now. As for Blackstar, that is a more legitimate possibility, but I don't like it. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. So it comes down to you being stubborn again. It isn't stubbornness, just efficiency. There's no amount of stealth that will help little Blackstar hide himself in the air. It's just relativity. Blackstar is far smaller than any one of us, and also has the best evasive maneuvers. At the same time, the Raypaks likely know that there's a bunch of humans running around in their territory by now. They might not be ready to spot a little mink. And on top of that, can't little Blackstar change form as well? If it comes down to it, it might be worth exploring the possibility of using that to our advantage. I just think it's still better if I go. You aren't explaining. It's hard to explain. It isn't. I know why you want to go. For one, you don't want to put Blackstar in danger. And secondly, you trust in your ability to react to unforeseen circumstances far more than anyone else. You're just reluctant to say so because it proves my point. Lionel opened his mouth to respond, but suddenly found that he had nothing to say. Little Blackstars had bobbed back and forth between them as the two argued, if it could even be called that. He seemed very curious about how this would end, and even seemed amused about how Aina had cornered Lionel. Whenever Lionel made an assessment, there were 2 things he always took into consideration. The first was what the situation was at face value, and the second was what the situation had a chance of mutating and warping into. The first was straightforward enough. However, the more likely the second was to cause his analysis to veer off path. The more likely it was that he would rather take on the burden himself. In Lionel's opinion, there was simply no one who could adapt to a change faster than he could. In fact, one of the only people to ever impress him with their adaptation ability, Emna Baysiran from Crimson Hall, was a woman he almost immediately invited to become one of his generals. To this day, she had still been the only person he had ever tried to recruit like that. Sometimes he still lamented that he didn't manage to win her over. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. These were the 2 forces tugging at Lionel's mind. And the truth was that even if Emna was here, he would still trust himself hundreds of times more. That was just how he was. He liked to cut out variables as much as possible. Even way back to the final game he and James had played together. Thinking to this point, Lionel closed his eyes and took a breath. When he opened them again, he rubbed his thumb on Blackstar's small little head. Ready, little guy? Yip. Yip. Black Star excitedly bounded into the air, flipping and vanishing into the fog before appearing around the corner. Aina smiled, but inwardly her heart was beating wildly. She felt that this was the right decision, but if things went poorly, it would become even more difficult for Lionel to make this choice again in the future. In a lot of ways, Lionel was right. He was able to adapt faster and better than most. The reason he was so confident that he could defeat people as strong as Aina despite being weaker was because raw strength wasn't his greatest asset, his mind was. Lionel had had no business defeating sixth-dimensional experts as a mere Tier 1 existence, and yet he had done so. That kind of confidence, that kind of bone-deep and unflappable poise in the face of terrible odds was all too rare. However, Aina also knew that if Lionel didn't learn how to trust that others could accomplish good as well, even if they weren't as great as him, his dreams wouldn't be able to progress very far. There was only so much a single person could accomplish. Aina looked toward Lionel's side profile, but he was already extremely focused. His gaze had frosted over, his expression had become unreadable, and an oppressive aura began to weigh down on the surroundings, suddenly making it difficult for the three youths behind them to breathe. Little Black Star shot out of the exit like a beam of black light, then performed a sharp 90-degree turn upward, flying into the skies. Lionel could feel his partner's excitement through their connection. Chapter 1353. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 34 seconds p.m. Chapter 1353. Shadow World. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1353. Shadow World. Little Black Star's speed was extraordinary. With the inherent darkness of the void battlefield, and the black fog that hung over everything, Aina had indeed been correct about the little mink's stealth ability. However, there was another reason that Lionel had chosen to go with Aina's suggestions, and that was because of the problem of visibility. While it seemed like a good idea to get higher ground and see further, there was one important matter that had to be considered, and that was the fog. Even back on Void Palace grounds, Lionel could hardly see a few meters ahead of himself, and this was fairly similar for everyone else as well. Lionel wasn't convinced that the void battlefield would be much better. In fact, it was likely that it would be even worse. Lionel had planned to circumvent this potential issue, using an internal sight manipulation technique. By changing the form of his internal sight, he could gain more range in a straight line simply by rearranging how he allocated its volume. With the sudden increase to his mind's strength, Lionel had been confident that he could do this. Of course, this came with a great risk. Internal sight was just another form of manipulating force, and it could be sensed by those sensitive to it, especially those of higher dimensions. It was possible that Raypaks would be less sharp about such things considering their immunity, but it was also just as likely that they'd be hypersensitive as seen by the first Raypaks Lionel had fought after coming to this nest. That particular Raypaks, due to Lionel's loose use of his internal sight, had already sensed him before he even rounded the corner. It was because of this that Lionel wasn't confident in avoiding detection using the fog, which was why he wanted to be the one to personally take on the burden. This aside, Little Black Star didn't have such an ability. He hadn't learned the technique Lionel had, nor did he have great use of internal sight. It was odd, but Lionel couldn't remember Little Black Star ever using internal sight at all. However, what Little Black Star could do was something else. The little mink was a shadow sovereign, and had access to the shadow world. The shadow world was considered to be a mirror of their current world, one where shadows reigned supreme. Whenever it was that Little Black Star became immune to outside attacks, it was because the little one had shifted his physical state into his shadow world. And whenever Little Black Star teleported, what was actually happening was him shifting to his shadow world then popping back out. This chapter upload first at NovelBin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext. To experience faster update speed. It had taken Lionel a very long time to construct the ins and outs of this ability, because Little Black Star couldn't communicate via conventional means, but he believed that he had some understanding of it now. Without getting overly lost in the details, Lionel had commanded Little Black Star to shoot into the air as high as he could. Once he was in position, he would shift into his shadow world. While within his shadow world, Little Black Star was essentially on a very short timer. Although being within the shadow world gave Little Black Star a great amount of control, it was also a great burden on the little guy. This was why Little Black Star never blinked away for too long. The little mink had 3 states. One where he was fully within the real world, a second where his image was in the real world, and his physical form was in the shadow world, and the third was one where his entire being was in the shadow world. Staying in the first and second state were relatively easier. However, to take full advantage of the shadow world, Little Black Star needed to enter the third state. The shadow world was shared by shadow sovereigns. As they moved about in the real world, so too would they shift within the shadow world. Whenever a shadow sovereign entered battle, that location of the shadow world they were in, the mirror image of their location in the real world, would effectively become their domain. Within this domain, the shadow sovereign would gain control over all sorts of abilities. But what Little Black Star used the most often was folding space. This was why the little mink could move so fast. By shifting into the shadow world, Black Star could fold reality to his whims and teleport. This even allowed him to do what Aina couldn't and leave and enter the segmented cube at will. However, this wasn't what Lionel wanted Little Black Star to do this time. By having control over a domain you would, by proxy, know every single little detail about that domain. Knowing this, Lionel's goal was obvious. He wanted Little Black Star to enter the shadow world and push the bounds of his domain as far as possible. In doing so, the little mink would gain a perfect understanding of everything within his domain in the blink of an eye, albeit for just a very small moment. This leads to an obvious question. Why risk Little Black Star like this, then? Couldn't this same thing be accomplished within the tunnels? And the unfortunate truth was no. Little Black Star had a hard enough time expanding his domain in the shadow world already without having to worry about thick barriers of wall infused and tempered with anarchic force over countless generations. Simply put, Black Star's attempts would end up being stalled before he even got the chance. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net Lionel didn't want Little Black Star to waste time trying to map out the tunnels. Instead, he wanted a perfect aerial view of the network of hives. After that, everything else could be left up to him. Little Black Star reached his apex height, his little body suddenly vanishing into a blackness. Almost instantaneously, several powerful auras swept over, sensing something amiss. However, they just barely missed Little Black Star entirely, ending up snagging their senses at empty air. Within the shadow world, a perfect replica of their world reflected in Little Black Star's eyes, but the range was too small to see everything. However, the good news was that in his domain, even the fog couldn't obstruct Little Black Star's vision any longer. The little guy had never tried to push the barriers before, but this time, he would go all out. Little Black Star's long whiskers twitched, his hair standing on end and his body seeming to expand by twice its original size. Bang! Little Black Star's domain grew explosively. Yip! A violent shudder suddenly shook the little mink's body, a ripple of pain coursing through his mind. Within the tunnels, Lionel's frosty gaze dropped several more levels of temperature. There's a second shadow sovereign in this place. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1354. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 33 seconds p.m. Chapter 1354. Smoldering. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1354. Smoldering. Lionel wasn't infuriated because there was a second shadow sovereign. From the very beginning, he had been aware that there was more than one. In fact, he knew a second one in Mordred. When he first learned about shadow sovereigns from Uncle Montez, he had introduced it in a way that Lionel knew from then that there would always be more than one. Without a doubt, the true reason Lionel was pissed was because Little Black Star had been hurt. It wasn't a devastating injury, but it was definitely one the little mink would need some time to recover from. Lionel had always treated Little Black Star like a little brother, a child that was still growing up. This was why he rarely if ever used Little Black Star in battle, even if the little one was a powerful warrior. Lionel had no doubt that compared to these geniuses of the Void Palace, little Blackstar was no worse. However, he was still reluctant to truly let him loose. And now his little brother had been harmed. How could he not be infuriated? The Shadow World was shared by Shadow Sovereigns. Under most situations, this wasn't a problem as they were rare beings to begin with. However, in the case that two Shadow Sovereigns did meet on the same battlefield, Lionel hadn't known exactly what would happen until now. The clash of domains had caused a strong backlash and harmed little Blackstar. In fact, Lionel could feel the malicious intent that converged on the tail end of the interaction. Little Blackstar had tried to envelop the network of hives with his domain from above. But this being the first time the little one had tried to do such a thing, he hadn't been prepared for the possibility of running into another domain. Yip! Little Blackstar fell from the skies. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext. To experience faster update speed. Lionel had already moved, rounding the corner and catching little Blackstar from the air. His expression was as dark as could be. Little Blackstar's small eyes were tightly closed, a hint of blood trickling from his nose. He trembled as though he had just been plunged into freezing waters. Lionel cradled the little mink in his arms, his snow force reaching out and caressing him from head to toe. It was only after this that Blackstar showed the slightest hints of relief. However, the smoldering fury in Lionel's gaze only seemed to grow hotter. In those moments, had little Blackstar not retreated beneath his command fast enough, the result could have been devastating. A shadow world was tied to something intrinsic within a shadow sovereign, and the loss of it was equivalent to the loss of a life. He had been that close to losing his partner of so many years. Lionel? Aina's voice came from his side. To her, this was the worst-case scenario. Even though she knew that this was the best course of action to take, and that her logic had been sound, it was simply human nature to feel terrible. If she hadn't said anything, this wouldn't have happened. But then again, the person to suffer would have likely been Lionel instead. It's not your fault, Lionel said softly. It's mine. I've sheltered him too much. He has no idea how to deal with situations where the enemy isn't a ridiculous amount weaker than him. Aina's gaze flickered. Lionel's words were sound, but they had a biting cold to them that he couldn't seem to retrieve just yet. Despite the fact they were standing out in the open of the void battlefield, he made no movement to retrieve, as though he was begging someone to come. No, I'm sorry. I should have taken that into account as well. Aina shook her head. Lionel didn't reply, but he truthfully didn't blame Aina. Judging a decision by only its result and nothing else was foolish, and it wasn't the kind of logic Lionel would prescribe to. However, that wouldn't stop him from feeling like this. He stroked little Blackstar's head, hoping to soothe the little mink just the slightest bit more. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. What happened? Aina asked. Blackstar's shadow domain clashed with another shadow sovereign's domain. He wasn't ready for the backlash and now he's hurt. The three youths, hearing the term shadow sovereign, froze. That little beast was a shadow sovereign. The mixture of jealousy, apprehension and darker thoughts was almost immediate. However, the heavy atmosphere around Lionel seemed to snap them out of such thoughts. They weren't fools. That sort of oppression wasn't normal, and should even come from a rare type of ability. The number of families they could think of that had such abilities was all too small, and each one of them was from astounding families. They had great backgrounds themselves, as did pretty much everyone in the Void Palace. But there were still levels and degrees of separation to be found everywhere. Then it's a failure? Aina asked. No, it wasn't a failure, Lionel explained. The domain of the second Shadow Sovereign was just a small point toward the center of the hive. For whatever reason, they had shrunk down their domain to an incredibly small degree, at least in comparison to what their true abilities should be. It's likely that there are other reasons for this. Regardless, little Blackstar managed to find us several points toward a true exit. Lionel explained all of this calmly and evenly, his voice not wavering in the slightest. Everything about his demeanor was steady. However, Aina could almost feel his fury. Although it had just been for a few split seconds, Lionel had already memorized the images Blackstar had shared to him perfectly without missing even a single detail. He knew the location of a true exit, what could be found there, and he also knew the exact locations of every entrance in a section of the network. That Shadow Sovereign likely knows we're here then, Aina concluded. Yes. They will know that we're located somewhere within the range of Little Blackstar's domain. But, I truly hope they come. Lionel's hair danced lightly in the air, a smoldering crimson flickering in his irises. Chapter 1355. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 31 seconds p.m. Chapter 1355. Come again? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1355. Come again? Aina didn't say anything toward Lionel's words. But seeing the state Little Blackstar was in, her expression too turned cold. She had been too wrapped up in her initial guilt to feel the same rage Lionel did. But after that faded, it wasn't a surprise that she didn't feel too differently. However, for the three listening to this conversation, they felt like they were listening to an insane pair of people. You wanted to meet a Shadow Sovereign? Excuse me? Just judging by the state Little Blackstar was in, this Shadow Sovereign was most likely at least within the 6th dimension, if not higher. The fact they had deployed their shadow domain here also likely meant that they were a Raypax. It had to be understood that Raypax with non-physical type ability indexes were extraordinarily rare. Often, they were taken to be cripples by their race. However, there were a small percentage of this already rare contingent that were seen as even more valuable than those with the most powerful physical type ability indexes. In this case, a Shadow Sovereign would most definitely be among this number. This meant that this Raypax wasn't just a ruined Raypax. It was definitely an elite amongst ruined Raypax and would be treated as such. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. That was because there was a hidden struggle between Shadow Sovereigns that only involved them. Each Shadow Sovereign was a unique sort of existence, but it was also very difficult for them to improve as a result. However, swallowing another Shadow Sovereign's domain was an easy shortcut to this sort of improvement. It wasn't a matter of if this Shadow Sovereign was coming, it was a matter of when. With Little Blackstar in such a vulnerable position, he was practically easy food. The fact that Little Blackstar was a beast only made it all the more enticing because his beast crystal could be taken and swallowed as well, allowing the Raypax to benefit twice over. This chapter upload first at NovelBin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. They should be running for their lives, not standing menacingly out in the open, as though they couldn't wait for confrontation. That was suicide. The middle young man finally couldn't seem to take it anymore, and stepped forward. Listen, I know exactly how my words are going to come off as, but I don't care. Our lives are on the line here. It's fine if you want to stay and get revenge for your beast companion, but we can't risk our lives along with you. If you could tell us which direction is closest to the exit, I would greatly appreciate it. The young man was known as Ogier. He tried to choose an approach that was respectful, but also forceful in what he was asking. He didn't want this to devolve into a battle, but if it had to, he was ready nonetheless. He had no will to risk his life for the sake of a little beast he had just met. At the same time, he knew that he had no right to ask for information this very same little beast had risked its life to get. However, without this information, he didn't believe he could survive. Toward such ends, he could only choose the path of the hypocrite. No one would care about this in 10 years when he was alive and these two were dead. However, what Ogier hadn't expected was that direction. You can go now. Lionel pointed straight between two of the entrances and toward an expanse of fog. He didn't particularly care whether these people stayed with them or not. And the truth was that he hadn't wanted to take them along to begin with. The only reason he had was because of his conscience. However, since they wanted to go, he wouldn't stop them. Ogier froze. He opened his mouth to say thank you, but then he suddenly thought of a large problem. What if he was lying? His heart began to beat out of his chest. Technically, they were all still in competition, right? What if Lionel wanted a convenient method of dealing with them? This chapter upload first at NovelBin.net. Net Ogre didn't know what to say or do for a very long time. He couldn't even think of a way to ensure that this was the truth. Are you lying to us? The only young woman of the three stepped forward, her brows knit into a frown. Roxanne, we need to ask. If he's sending us off to our deaths out of spite, then wouldn't we be dying for nothing? It's true that he doesn't owe us anything, but that wouldn't give him the right to screw us over, right? The last of the three stepped forward, realizing that there was only one side of this issue that he could stand upon. If he didn't side with Roxanne and Ogre, he would have no way of confirming his own safety as well. Lionel met the momentum of the three across from him with a deadpan expression. Quite frankly, he wasn't in the mood, not at all. This was the absolute worst time for anyone to antagonize him. He was very close to attacking and leaving them here to rot in their own foolishness. Even though he could understand where they were coming from, he simply didn't have the patience for it. The fact they had run into him in the first place was already a blessing for them, but it seemed that they hadn't realized this. Even their previous battle had only ended because his father had scared the Rapax they were fighting away. How exactly do you expect us to prove this to you? Surprisingly, it was Aina who spoke instead, her expression frosting over as her battle axe vibrated. There's a simple solution. You seem to care about your beast partner, and it's in far too injured a state to help you in battle regardless. Give it to us and we'll follow your directions. That way we'll be rest assured in the fact you aren't lying to us. Roxanne had hardly finished her words when she felt her knees go weak. Come again? Aina asked coldly. Chapter 1356. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 30 seconds p.m. Chapter 1356. Bully if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1356. Bully. It was oh so very convenient. The logic was sound and there was nothing wrong with it in a perfectly neutral sort of sense. Taking little Blackstar with them would definitely guarantee that it would be in Lionel's best interest not to lie to them. After all, he cared about his beast companion surviving, right? It was clever. However, it was from that point that everything else collapsed. Lionel owed these people nothing. Why would he leave his little brother with three individuals he had just as little trust in as they did him? On top of that, just because he hadn't said anything about it, didn't mean that Lionel didn't notice their shift in demeanor when learning that Blackstar was a shadow sovereign. Just how convenient was this? They got to force Lionel to hand over someone dear to him, and in their minds, he would likely die seeking revenge, and then they would get a convenient and very valuable beast to use or sell in the future. Was there anything in the world that could be so good? If it wasn't for Aina stepping forward first, Lionel would have likely already lashed out, his smoldering fury bubbling over to deal with these three before he met the thing that had put his little brother in such a state. I'll give you all 3 seconds to get the fuck out of my sight, or I'll make it so that you can't even if you want to. Aina's aura pressed down on them from above, and it suddenly became obvious why she was the only one who seemed completely unmoved by Lionel's own every time. You. Roxanne's brows jumped, but the fiery glow of Aina's golden eyes seemed to suppress her impulse to react before it could even manifest. A menacing darkness loomed overhead and Aina's canines grew as delicate black patterns ran over her skin. The oppression seemed to triple in an instant, only growing with every passing moment that went by. Lionel's gaze shifted from the three before them to the intricate tattoos forming on Aina's toned back. They followed her curves and gave her a bestial sort of aura that was highly enticing. Abyssal Panther. Lionel had almost forgotten that Aina had gained this treasure from terrain, and most importantly, had forgotten exactly what that meant and represented. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novelnext. To experience faster update speed. It wasn't entirely Lionel's fault. He hadn't been there when Aina first unchained herself from her curse and City Lord White had called her a blood sovereign. Lionel was still ignorant to this, or even what such a title even meant. But what he did know were 2 things. First, Aina could do what other humans could not in absorbing beast blood, and taking their strengths as her own. This meant she could essentially create any lineage factor she wanted so long as she had the blood to do it. And second, her existence was a lethal attraction to invalids, and especially variant invalids. In her rage, Aina's blood had begun to boil and her abyssal panther blood resurfaced, giving her a carnivorous edge. The first second felt like an eternity, but the second whizzed by so fast that it felt like they had been thrust into a pot of boiling oil. Their feet lit, and their hearts threatened to jump out of their throats. Without a word, they dashed away, feeling the oppression about to suffocate them from all sides. The three clenched their fists as they picked a tunnel to rush into, unsurprisingly in the direction of Lionel's finger. If I wasn't so injured. Roxanne's nails dug into her palms, soothing herself with these thoughts of revenge and excuses. Ultimately, they were geniuses in their own right. How could they feel good about any of this? Now they could only hope that Lionel truly hadn't lied. You didn't run into any invalids while you were away? Lionel suddenly asked. Aina's back was still faced toward him, and he couldn't seem to take his eyes off of her slowly receding tattoos. Aina turned back and smiled like a blossoming flower. It was just a simple question, but its meaning meant the world to her. Lionel was actually asking about her well-being. She didn't think she would miss something so simple, so profoundly. A small bit. I entered a subdimensional zone of the Silver Empire a few months ago, and ran into some trouble there. But I came out fine. Lionel's brows shot up when he heard the word Silver Empire. It was an interesting coincidence. After a moment, Lionel nodded. Aina's words seemed to remind him of something else. As much as he wanted to control everything, there had been certain points where his people had been just fine on their own. His brothers had survived years in the dimensional verse without him. Aina had been through countless life and death experiences when he was nowhere to be found. Even the likes of Savon had been all on her own for a very long time. It was easy for him to only see things he had been through and filter everything through that lens, but there were people around him that had arguably been through worse. Every time he tried to shoehorn them into needing his protection, he was actually belittling them. This chapter upload first at novelbin.net. Have you thought about finding more powerful blood to ingest? I'm holding back on doing that for now. I'm very close to grasping a new, evolved force. Once I do, it'll burn away what remains of my curse and breakthrough. Oh, you're still holding back, huh? Lionel chuckled. Aina grinned. It's okay, you're still handsome when your face is swollen. I don't mind protecting you for a few more decades. Decades. Lionel scoffed. Like I said, I can beat you right now. Maybe you can, but would you? Aina blinked innocently, stretching her arms down toward her back and clasping her palms to rest on her ass. She leaned forward slightly and almost instantly, her chest seemed to double in size, her eyes glittering as she observed Lionel. Lionel opened his mouth to respond, but suddenly found that his throat had dried out. Damned hormones, they had failed him again. Lionel shook his head and looked away. Come on, little Blackstar, let's go kill some Raypaks. She really thinks she can bully us into submission. Aina's smile brightened as Lionel turned and walked away. She hadn't been this happy in a very long time. She sent a glance toward where the three youths had disappeared before entering a different entrance with Lionel. Not long after they had left, bang! A Raypax fell heavily from above, its silver body rippling with power and strength. Its head turned from side to side, eyeing three entrances before it made a choice and dove into one. Chapter 1357. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 29 seconds p.m. Chapter 1357. Easy to trust if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1357. Easy to trust. Aina thought about going to kill those three. It would make her feel more at ease. Plus, there was also the chance that she would be able to take the final step toward earning an amethyst token if she did. But she decided against it. For one, she didn't want to waste her and Lionel's time. Plus, though she knew Lionel likely wouldn't stop her, he wouldn't be ecstatic about it either. He was always soft when it came to that kind of thing, and Aina wasn't fooled by his newfound bravado. Under the surface, he was still very much the same Lionel. If anything, he was only being more open with his true self around her. The core parts of his character had always remained unchanged. There's no need to be so eager. Karma has its way of working things out. Aina shook her head. You? Believing in karma? You could come up with a better lie, you know. You just don't want me to kill them. Lionel smiled, lightly stroking little Blackstar's head. The little one was doing a bit better now, but Lionel could still feel him wince from time to time. He was too sensitive to little Blackstar's usual state to miss when he had shifted so far from baseline. Others might have a hard time reading a beast's emotions, but that wasn't the case for Lionel, especially when it came to a beast he was so intimately familiar with. A small distraction was exactly the kind of thing Lionel needed right now. Usually, such a thing would be almost impossible to find in a place like this, but he happened to have Aina by his side. As much as she had missed his care, Lionel had almost forgotten how much he liked to just talk with her. Lionel didn't get to do much talking these days. His most recent intimate conversations were with a 1,000-year-old ghost, and the other was in a drunken state he would rather forget. If Raj ever let him, that is. In a lot of ways, during their time together, Aina had become his best friend. This was maybe the greatest aspect of their relationship he had been ignoring the fact he missed. This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net if you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. Though they had been cordial over the last few days, and even somewhat close, there had always been a barrier there that neither had crossed. Aina out of respect and Lionel out of stubbornness? But this was why the words of his father were so profound to Lionel. He remembered that day he was in the Mayan tomb, a naked girl kneeling over him and threatening to choke what remained of his life out of his body. Back then, he had realized it was his 18th birthday and he sighed in relief. He had sighed in relief because if he died after his 18th birthday, it would no longer be his father's burden. His dad wouldn't have to feel guilt. He would have done his duty in getting Lionel to adulthood. It had been so long since then, but the sentiment still hung over Lionel's head. But his father's words seemed to snap him away. There wasn't some demarcating line where a father stopped being a father, and a son stopped being a son. Lionel's logical brain had tried to make it like that, but it simply wasn't how life worked. To his dad, he was probably the very same baby boy he had been more than 2 decades ago. His father's words had sounded sharp and grating, but to Lionel they were like a pass. His father reminding him that it was all right for him to take his time to grow, that he didn't have to be perfect immediately, that he still had his old man protecting him to his front. When it came to his father, it was very easy for Lionel to trust. Maybe not karma in the normal sense, but the old ghost has told me a lot of interesting things about force and how it breathes life into everything around it. It made me think, if force is the underlying foundation to all that there is, and every action causes a disruption in it, then there might very well be some supernatural balance that keeps everything in check. Who knows, maybe karma is real then. Aina blinked. Old ghost? This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. Lionel laughed. He had forgotten that there were now things in his life Aina was completely ignorant to. He was so used to telling her everything and her knowing everything he meant that he hadn't considered an opposing worldview. When Aina was caught up with Y's star order and everything related to him, her brows shot up. Unsurprisingly, she didn't like the idea of Lionel being in a constant death match with an old man so much more seasoned and experienced than him. But it seemed that there would be no convincing Lionel otherwise, so she could only take a step back in this regard. Aina fell into her thoughts, her mind suddenly feeling as though it was blooming towards something new. The words Lionel had used to explain how Y's star order viewed the dimensional verse weren't things that she had ever heard before. No. It was more accurate to say that she had known of them, but she had never heard them stated so clearly and firmly. It made her wonder, was this how her intuition worked? Did the force speak to her like it had a life of their own? Is that what was always whispering to her whenever she made a decision about her training? Whenever she chose ingredients for a meal or a pill concoction? Aina's breathing grew deep and unhurried, her gaze glazing over for several moments. Seeing this, Lionel smiled but didn't say anything. It seemed that she was having another breakthrough. Right then Lionel's gaze suddenly sharpened. He gently placed little Blackstar on Aina's shoulder before his figure vanished. In the very next instant he had appeared dozens of meters away, soaring through the air above the head of a ruined Rapax. His eyes glowed with a hidden crimson light, a murderous intent erupting from him. Chapter 1358. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 27 seconds p.m. Chapter 1358. Couldn't if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1358 couldn't bang. Lionel's fist flew forward like a falling meteor, shattering the metallic carapace of ruined Rapax before him. From start to finish, it had been an absolute slaughter. What had started off as a Rapax stalking their position had immediately turned into an all-out assault. In one moment, Lionel had been by Aina's side, in the next he was above a Rapax's head, his fist falling as though an ice-infused rock through the atmosphere. His gaze flashed with a hidden rune, his body covered in a destructive crimson coating that seemed to burn everything in its path. In a single strike, a Tier 9 5th dimension ruined Rapax had fallen without even a method to fight back. As cautious as Lionel had been last time, he didn't even bother to store this Rapax away before it died. His foot stamped down on its neck, shattering its spine and severing his head from its shoulders. Then he ripped out what remained of its spine, taking with it its tail. He snapped it all together, squeezing tight until the joints crumpled together into a long makeshift polearm with a scorpion-like blade on one end. It alone was easily over 3 meters long, but Lionel didn't seem to care at all. Ignoring the dismembered corpse, he took his new spear and turned back to find Aina waiting with little Blackstar in her arms. "Don't look at me like that. There was really nothing I could say this time," Lionel said. This chapter upload first at NovelBin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. It was true. The Rapax had just fallen from the skies and it tried to stalk them. Maybe because it had more questions than answers about certain things. It wasn't exactly the situation for Lionel to explain things before he acted. "No, you definitely could have, but that's not what I'm looking at you for. You got stronger again." "Oh that. I was teetering on a breakthrough before I fought the 6th-dimensional ruined Rapax, and I broke through just before I beat it. It's pretty useful." Aina's irises twinkled. Her senses weren't as sharp as Lionel's, but her battle sense and intuition was on a different level entirely. She could tell that Lionel's force output, as in the strength in his arms and legs, hadn't changed at all. And yet somehow his damage potential had skyrocketed enough to make a ruined Rapax look like Play-Doh. The difference was enormous. Of course, the only ruined Rapax Lionel had fought until now was a 6th-dimensional one, so he didn't have an appropriate gauge for how powerful they were in the 5th dimension. But they still knew enough to know that they should be more powerful than that. This breakthrough Lionel was speaking of was the formation of his Scarlet Star rune. He had been on the verge of forming it before, and just barely managed to against the 6th-dimensional ruined Rapax. Unfortunately against it, it hadn't been enough. But against its lower dimensional counterpart, it was a different matter entirely. In its presence, things tended to become far more fragile than they really were, and even without any additional force output, it was as though the world scaled down in its sturdiness to benefit Lionel. Plus, it felt more pointed and controlled. Lionel was a bit confident now that he could use a spear without destroying it, but he still chose this route instead so that he could fine-tune some things. This spear would do him well enough for now. Plus, he felt that he was close to Tier 6 after forming his rune, and he didn't want to have to lose another spear under the whims of a sudden breakthrough as his 8th star formed. Aina, though, didn't take her off of Lionel. "I know I looked very valiant just now, but I have a head between these broad shoulders." Lionel feigned hurt. "You can't just look at me like a slab of meat." Aina was caught off guard for a moment before she sputtered. She knew this was Lionel's way of getting her back for just moments before. Maybe only these two could so casually banter this deep into enemy territory, as though there wasn't a hunter coming at them right this moment. This chapter upload first at NovelBin.net. That's not it. It's just that your dad seemed to have done something to you. You don't feel any different? Nothing's changed? Lionel paused for a moment, not answering immediately. The two broke out into a run once again, heading down the winding tunnels. Lionel's sense of direction was immaculate, And despite the number of twists and turns they took, he was always able to point out the very same direction he had pointed out to the three youths that had followed them. He only had two goals in mind. The first was to avoid the center of these nests. There was no doubt that they were the most protected regions, and they would also have the most powerful warriors. The center was where the eggs should converge and be located, so it made sense they would be the most heavily guarded. With this goal in mind, he had to ensure that the paths he took brought him closer to the direction he wanted to go while not locking them into an obvious death sentence. The second goal, obviously, was to continue to head in the direction of the nearest exit. I'm not sure. It both feels like I've changed and that I haven't. My mind is clearer and more relaxed. My number of split minds increased another tenfold from 10 million, and I've suddenly thought of countless other ways to use my ability index. But I also don't feel different. It just feels natural. Lionel knew that there was something off. His ability had gone from being suppressed back down to Tier 3, to suddenly being stronger within Tier 4 than he had ever been in a benign environment. He had no doubt that if he returned to a lesser world now, he would experience another huge burst to his ability that was still being hampered here. It was just that he couldn't understand why. Fallen Apostle's reception has been amazing. Thank you all for the support. Chapter 1359. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 25 seconds p.m. Chapter 1359. Square 1. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1359. Square 1. Lionel had been aware that his father had been tinkering with his body for a long while. Maybe it took a personality like Lionel's to not be bothered by it in the slightest. The first oddity was obviously the vomit smoothies he had been forced to drink for as long as he could remember. His father had been so insistent that despite hating it with all his being, Lionel still never missed a single day. In the end, it seemed to have been worth it. Originally, Lionel had thought that it was designed to strengthen his body. Right after the metamorphosis, his body seemed to undergo odd burst periods where his speed and strength would increase faster than they should for a person without using a special training technique or method. But after reawakening his innate node, Lionel became almost 100% certain that the smoothies were actually for the purpose of providing enough strength to allow him to accomplish such a feat. Something he hadn't quite understood was an enormous deal until meeting Y's Star Order. However, now Lionel was suddenly not so sure anymore. For one, the entire reason he had had such an enormous store of anarchic force within his body to begin with was because, according to Y's Star Order, he had stolen energy from the regulator. If the energy he needed to reform his innate node came from the regulator, then what role did the smoothies play? Was he overthinking things? Had he been mistaken? Or was it that both had played a role? This chapter upload first at NovelBin. Net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit NovelNext.com to experience faster update speed. Lionel suddenly felt that he understood far too little about his dad. The man was messing with his son's body as though he had access to the knobs that defined everything that was him. That old man probably knows how to create lineage factors. I don't doubt it at all. Lionel thought to himself. Lionel shook his head, his mind somehow both absent and running a million miles an hour at the same time. His father seemed to be dealing with a burden he wasn't telling anyone about. Lionel wanted to help, but there was really only so much he could do. Not while he was still so weak. This was another large part of the reason he had made the decision to set aside the king nonsense for now to focus on blooming his own strength. As for how he would do that, he would just continue almost the path he was already on, focusing on comprehending his innate node. He hadn't forgotten that that ticking time bomb was still looming over his head. At the same time, he also had to gain a firmer comprehension of his ability index as well, though that no longer seemed to be as important now that he could access Tier 4 on the Void battlefield. Y's Star Order had said that Lionel's Dream Force affinity was far too high for the level of mastery he had over his ability index, but he still had no real idea how to use it. This situation seemed to answer the question of how quite well. His father had sealed a portion of his ability, or at least what seemed like his ability. As for what extent, by Lionel's estimation, It should probably be a level infinitesimally close to the savant realm. If he was truly a savant, he shouldn't be able to utilize force or comprehend the universal cycles. So this was the best explanation he could come up with. Of course, Lionel had thought of the wild possibility that his father had actually suppressed his ability from the savant levels down to normal ranges precisely, so that he could do what savants normally could not. But after some more thought, Lionel felt that this was likely not the case. This chapter upload first at Novelbin. Net. While it wasn't the first time his father had accomplished something impossible, this felt like far more of a special case. During the months Lionel was bedridden and couldn't move, he had had a great number of talks with Wise Star Order, and in that time, he had come to understand savants a bit more. The main reason Lionel thought it was impossible was because suppressing the ability of savants wasn't a rare ability. No, it was rare. It was instead more accurate to say that all those of a certain level of power could do so. This power referred not to individual power, but rather the power of a family or organization. The suppression and control of savants was an entire sort of industry in and of itself, and it wasn't as difficult as it might seem, or else savants would rule everything. In fact, the favored method of organizations and families that had savants was precisely to suppress them from Tier 5 down to a lesser Tier 4 or Tier 3. In extreme cases, it was even possible to suppress a savant down to the point they had no ability to access whatsoever, exactly like Earth had done with its savants. The methods ranged from as simple as Earth's, which only required isolating the savants from force, to far more sophisticated methods wherein savants might even end up permanently crippled, without special intervention. This was all to say that even in such situations where savants were suppressed to lesser tiers, they were still unable to do as Lionel could do and begin to increase their strength as a normal person would. The moment you were born a savant, you were forever cut off from such things. And that didn't even consider the biggest elephant in the room. If Lionel was born a savant, he would have never been gifted an innate node by the regulator to begin with. Savants couldn't have or form nodes, so they likewise couldn't have innate nodes. In addition, if a savant were to be given control over Scarlet Star Force, they would be similar to Elther and his chaotic particle affinity. They wouldn't be given an innate node to begin with. This evidence left Lionel at a bit of a loss for how to comprehend his father's actions. It truly felt too disjointed and none of it made sense. So, he was right back to square one. Not understanding a thing. The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. Chapter 1360. Published at 10th of November, 2022, 12:43 and 24 seconds p.m. Chapter 1360. Profound analysis. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1360. Profound analysis. It wasn't all bad, though. This gave Lionel a chance to breathe a sigh of relief. Without having to worry about the weakness of his ability index for a while, he could focus on his Scarlet Star innate node like he had wanted to. The formation of a single rune seemed to remind Lionel of just how far away he was from comprehending it entirely. This singular rune was just a small branch of a small corner of a small segment of a small piece of the overall natural force art that called his innate node home. Having comprehending a single one, his force seemed to flow smoother, and his destructive capability had skyrocketed. But other than this, it was just a reminder that he was weak. If I had to improve, what would you say I have to do? Lionel suddenly asked Aina. The two had been running for quite a while, but the tunnels were far too expansive. They hadn't even run into another Raypax in over an hour. Lionel's sense of direction had remained true, and they were getting closer to their destination. Right now, Lionel could imagine them curling around the center of this particular nest, avoiding its core regions while slingshotting closer to the exit. This method would take longer, but it was also safer. And, with the boost to his internal sight, Lionel could ensure that it stayed that way. As much as he wanted revenge for Little Black Star, there were only so many Shadow Sovereigns the Raypax could have. Not to mention the fact they were a rare breed to begin with, the Raypax rarely awakened such abilities as well. To Lionel, this meant that he would be able to find this individual again in due time so long as they didn't die. You're asking me? Aina raised an eyebrow. I don't know if I'm the best to ask. The path I take is different from yours. This chapter upload first at novel.bin.net. If you want to read more chapters, please visit Novel Next. To experience faster update speed. Aina and Lionel never really interfered in each other's training. They just left each other to their own devices. So Aina was a bit caught off guard by this question as well. I want to know your opinion. When our minds connected, you felt it too, right? Aina blushed slightly. That experience was a bit. Well, she had definitely been impulsive. But whether it was true or not, she still felt that allowing Lionel into her mind like that had made it far easier for him to make the decision he had just moments ago. She wasn't wrong in thinking this either. Though Lionel had tried to ignore it, Aina's emotions had hit him like a ton of bricks. But as he had said, he was very good at closing himself off from such emotions. Aina had mostly been able to ignore that moment, because she fell into a deep sleep right afterward. But now that Lionel had brought it up, all those memories kept rushing back. It was just a shame that Lionel's mind was far too complex for her to truly understand in that short span of time. Unlike Wise Star Order, she couldn't shift through millions of minds in the blink of an eye. I did, but it was too vague. It was hard to get a read on you because you have too many split minds. And at the same time, my ability weakened a lot when applied to another person. That's fine, just tell me your perspective. Well, I don't really need to tell you what my ability thought. I can just tell you what I think from observing you. When you said you could beat someone as powerful as me 10 out of 10 times, I don't think you were lying, but I think that's actually part of the problem. Well, it isn't objectively a problem, but it's rather a problem relatively speaking considering the path you seem to be taking. This chapter upload first at novel.bin.net. Lionel was intrigued. He was interested in what Aina wanted to say. Right now you are focusing on your innate node, and rightfully so. Most probably should do that, especially if you're on a ticking time clock like your ancestor said. But given your battle style, it might make more sense to focus more on your ability instead. Your raw battle strength isn't your greatest strength, your mind is. Battle sense is something that's difficult to quantify, and it's especially so for you. Within a certain reasonable range, even without time to prepare, I would think that there are a rare few people you can't defeat. If you had time to prepare, I think that even outside a reasonable range, you could still find a path to victory. But that's exactly the problem. Honing your strength requires repeatedly nailing down your strengths, then doubling and tripling down. It's all about reproducing results and making sure that your battles are almost formulaic in their outcome. In my opinion, the strongest warriors are those that can force any enemy to fight on their chosen battlefield. Then, upon making said enemy meet you on your terms, you can reproduce the same victory again and again. You, though, are the exact opposite. Because your mind is your greatest asset, the more variables there are, the more randomness and variety, the higher your chances. But because of that, you can't reproduce your results. Every victory looks different, and you don't mind meeting an enemy on their battlefield. This can look like a good thing, but what it also means is that a large majority of the training you do ends up being wasted. For every 100% increase to your overall strength, the strongest person you can defeat increases by a marginal amount until you trigger a watershed. Sometimes the return is even worse. One day you might double your speed, but you're just as content to not move a single step in a battle so long as you think this is the best approach to victory. At the same time, you might break through in your bowmanship, but you won't even bother to use it if you can think of a better method. Because you approach battle like this, focusing on anything other than your mind seems like a waste of effort. Or at the very least, it should be your main focus. Lionel fell into silence. He knew that Aina would have something profound to say, but this was still beyond his expectations. What should he do? The novel will be updated first on this website. Come back and continue reading tomorrow, everyone. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.